The fluorescent lights inside the tactical sensitive compartmented information facility hummed at a frequency you stopped hearing after the first hour. They cast a flat, bluish-white glow over the rows of monitors and keyboards, over the stained foam cups and the crumpled energy drink cans, over the faces of the soldiers who sat in that room day after day, staring into databases that contained the raw, unfiltered truth of two simultaneous wars. The air smelled of recycled dust and instant coffee. The walls were prefabricated metal, held together with bolts the size of a fist. Outside, the Iraqi desert in January pressed its cold against everything, turning breath visible, making the Humvees in the motor pool creak and groan. But inside the Tactical Operations Center at FOB Hammer, 25 miles east of Baghdad in the flat agricultural plain of Wazit province, the only weather was the hum of machinery and the soft clicking of keys. It was early January 2010. Specialist Bradley Manning, who would come to know herself years later as Chelsea, sat at a workstation in that room and carried a burden that had no name yet. She was 22 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, 105 pounds. She had arrived in Iraq the previous November, assigned to the 2nd Brigade Combat Team of the 10th Mountain Division, and her job was to sit in precisely that room, in precisely that chair, and read the secret architecture of the war fought in the country surrounding her. She was an intelligence analyst. That was her designation, her purpose, the reason the United States Army had spent months and considerable money training her. Her task was to take the raw data flowing in from surveillance assets, drone feeds, intercepted communications, and field reports, and turn it into something commanders could use. She was supposed to look at the information and see the war clearly, so that the war could be prosecuted more efficiently. What she saw instead broke something inside her that could not be put back together. Manning had access to systems that most people in the United States, most people in the world, did not know existed in their current form. Through the secret Internet Protocol router network known as SIPRnet, she could pull up classified cables from the State Department, military operational reports from Afghanistan and Iraq, intelligence assessments, threat analyses, and situation reports filed by thousands of soldiers in the field. Through the Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communication System, JWICS, she could reach even deeper into materials classified at the top secret level and above. These were not systems that a soldier had to fight to access. In the years after the September 11th attacks, the United States intelligence community had deliberately expanded the number of people with access to classified networks, driven by the painful lesson of that morning, that agencies had failed to share information with each other, that critical intelligence had sat in silos while the plot unfolded undetected. The response was to open the pipes, to make sharing the default, to give analysts at all levels the ability to cross-reference, correlate, and synthesize information from multiple streams. By 2010, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million people held clearances that allowed them to access SIPRnet. Manning was one of them. She was also, whether the Army had fully appreciated it or not, a person of extraordinary intellectual sensitivity operating inside a machine of extraordinary moral complexity. She had spent her childhood reading everything she could find, teaching herself to code before most of her peers understood what code was. She processed information quickly, retained it easily, and made connections that analysts twice her age might have missed. These were the qualities that made her valuable to the intelligence mission. They were also the qualities that made what she encountered in that room impossible for her to simply file away and forget. The war in Iraq had officially entered what the Pentagon called a new phase. The surge of troops ordered by President George W. Bush in 2007 had nominally reduced the levels of sectarian violence that had turned Baghdad into a city of checkpoints and mass graves. By 2009, Barack Obama had been elected on a platform that included a commitment to end the combat mission in Iraq and bring American troops home. Plans were in motion. Timelines were being drafted. The war was, by the accounting of governments and press briefings, winding down. But inside the databases that Manning could access from her workstation, the war looked different. It looked like a spreadsheet of the dead, a catalog of incidents reported with the sterile language of bureaucratic efficiency, where civilians killed by American fire were logged under categories that did not quite encompass the reality of a family destroyed. It looked like diplomatic cables in which American officials reported on the behavior of Allied governments with a candor that those governments would have found devastating to see in print. It looked, in short, like something that had been deliberately kept from the people who were paying for it, fighting it and dying in it. Manning read it all. That was her job. And she could not stop thinking about who else should be reading it. The base itself was a sprawling compound of reinforced concrete barriers, plywood structures, and the ubiquitous forward operating base aesthetic of tangled wire and sandbag walls. FOB Hammer had been established during the surge as part of the push to extend American presence into the areas east of Baghdad that had served as insurgent supply routes. Life there had the quality of enforced routine that military installations share with prisons, scheduled meals, scheduled duty, the constant awareness of confinement within a defined perimeter. The soldiers at FOB Hammer existed in a state of managed tension, aware at all times that the wire separating them from the surrounding countryside was the only thing between them and a landscape that had swallowed hundreds of their colleagues in the years before. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to focus on your task and trust that the tasks performed by others added up to something coherent and purposeful. Manning found compartmentalization difficult that winter. She had been struggling for nearly a year with a confluence of pressures, the psychological weight of her identity, which she had been carrying in secret for most of her life. The isolation of a personality that did not fit neatly into the culture of a combat unit. And now, in the databases spreading across the screen in front of her, the grinding daily pressure of knowing things that the world did not know and wondering whether that silence made her complicit in them. She had been corresponding with people back home, tenuously, through the narrow channels available to deployed soldiers. She had been reading philosophy and political theory when she could find access to the internet. She had been thinking, with increasing urgency, about the concept of public interest, about the relationship between the people who held power and the people over whom power was exercised, and about what happened when the information that would allow ordinary citizens to evaluate that relationship was locked away in systems only accessible to those with clearances. There is a particular quality to a moral crisis that is also a professional secret. You cannot discuss it with your chain of command. You cannot raise it in a meeting. The very information generating the crisis is classified, which means the crisis itself must be classified, which means you carry it alone, in a room full of colleagues who are themselves performing exactly the function they were hired to perform, who have found a way to hold the information at arm's length in a manner that preserves their equilibrium. Manning had not found that distance. She was not built for it. The information she encountered did not stay on the screen when she looked away from it. It followed her back to her bunk, into the dismal routines of base life, into the small hours of the morning when the desert sky outside was vast and indifferent and the lights of the TOC were the only illumination for miles. She was, in January 2010, a soldier sitting at the intersection of access and conscience, in possession of more secret information than almost any private individual in American history, and she was beginning to make a decision that would redefine what the word leaking meant in the age of digital warfare. The story of how she got to that chair, and what she chose to do from it, begins not in the desert of Iraq but in the quiet, unremarkable flatlands of central Oklahoma, in a small town where a child grew up knowing from a very young age that the world as experienced from the inside was not quite the world that others seemed to see. The decisions that alter history are rarely made in a single moment. They are accumulated, layer by layer, through years of experience and observation, through encounters with injustice in its large forms and its small ones, through the slow development of a conscience that refuses, in the end, to be quiet. By the time Manning sat at that workstation in January 2010, with her access credentials logged and the cursor blinking on a screen full of secrets, she had been preparing for this moment, without quite knowing it, for most of her life. To understand what she did and why, you have to go back to the beginning. To a house in Oklahoma where the television was always on and the arguments never quite stopped. To a child who found that the only universe that made complete sense was one she could build herself, line by line, in code. A 22-year-old soldier, 105 pounds, sitting at a keyboard in the Iraqi desert with access to more secrets than almost any private individual in American history, and a conscience that would not let her look away. What she did next shook governments, rewrote the rules of digital warfare, and forced the world to confront what was being done in its name. If that is the kind of story you came here for, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications, because this one demands to be heard from beginning to end. Crescent, Oklahoma is the kind of town that does not announce itself. Driving in from the highway, you pass grain elevators and flat fields and a water tower painted with the town's name in letters that have faded over decades of sun. And then you are there, and it looks exactly like everywhere else you have passed along that stretch of central Oklahoma. Modest houses set back from modest streets, churches on corners, a main road with a hardware store and a diner and a few gas stations. In 1990, Crescent had a population of about 1,400 people. It had the rhythms of a farming community and the quiet insularity of a place where most families had been there for generations and most people knew each other's business without needing to be told. It was not a place that produced people who made the front pages of newspapers around the world. It was a place where people were expected to stay within the lines, to grow up and work and raise families and not draw attention to themselves. Bradley Edward Manning was born on December 17, 1987, in Oklahoma City, and spent much of his early childhood in Crescent. His father, Brian Manning, had served in the United States Navy as an intelligence analyst, and the family had lived on and off the base before settling into civilian life in Oklahoma. Brian Manning was a quiet, self-contained man who drank and who, by multiple accounts, carried within him the specific emotional distance that military service can create in men of a certain generation, the habit of keeping feelings compressed, of not discussing the interior life in terms that might be considered soft or unnecessary. He worked for a time in IT after his Navy service and was, in the modest assessment of those who knew him, competent and private. Susan Manning, Chelsea's mother, was Welsh, born in Haverfordwest in the Pembrokeshire region of southwest Wales. She had met Brian when he was stationed in the United Kingdom, and she had followed him to America with the optimism that accompanies the early phase of a new life in a new country. Oklahoma, though, was a long way from the green valleys and coastal light of Pembrokeshire, and the years were not uniformly kind to her. She drank. The drinking worsened as the marriage deteriorated. By the time Chelsea, then Bradley, was approaching adolescence, the home on the quiet street in Crescent had become a place of accumulated tension, where the atmosphere shifted according to the state of the adults and the child learned, as children in such homes always do, to read the room before entering it. What saved Chelsea, in the way that certain children are saved by the discovery of a private universe into which the difficulties of the external world cannot reach, was technology. The family had a computer, one of the early home PCs that were beginning to appear in middle American households in the early 1990s, and Chelsea took to it with an intensity that surprised everyone who observed it. This was not the casual engagement of a child who liked video games. This was something more systematic, more probing, a genuine desire to understand how the machine worked at the level of its language, to get beneath the surface interface and find the logic operating underneath. By the time Chelsea was 10 years old, she was not just using the computer. She was understanding it. By 12, she was building simple programs, modifying software, finding the edges of what the hardware could be made to do by someone willing to spend hours in patient exploration. There is a quality that people who are unusually gifted with computers often share, an ability to hold large amounts of abstract information in working memory simultaneously, to see patterns across complex systems, to treat the gap between the current state of a thing and a desired state as a puzzle with a discoverable solution. Chelsea had this quality in abundance. It was visible to teachers who encountered her in school, though the visibility was complicated by the fact that she was also, in other respects, a difficult student, not in the sense of being disruptive, but in the sense of being unable or unwilling to engage with material she found uninteresting. She was capable of extraordinary focus when the subject engaged her. She was openly impatient when it did not. This is not a temperament that elementary school systems in central Oklahoma in the 1990s were especially equipped to accommodate. The social dimensions of childhood were harder still. Chelsea was a small child, slight in build, and possessed of a sensibility that did not match the expectations of the environment around her. She did not fit easily into the categories that school culture enforces on children, not into the male peer groups defined by athletics and aggression, not into the social hierarchies boys were expected to inhabit. She was sensitive and curious and could be intensely earnest, which in the specific ecosystem of a small American school made her a target for the particular cruelty that children direct at whoever cannot or will not conform. There was bullying. There were years of it, with the specific texture of small-town bullying. Prolonged, inescapable, deeply familiar because the perpetrators and the victim had known each other since kindergarten and would continue to know each other until someone left. She did not leave early enough for the difficult years not to have shaped her. The people who would later try to understand her, journalists, psychologists, lawyers, military investigators, would all grapple with the question of how much her childhood had made her into the person who would eventually sit at that workstation in Iraq. The question is not entirely answerable, because the relationship between childhood experience and adult action is never a clean equation. But what can be said with certainty is that Chelsea Manning grew up carrying identities she could not name and could not share, in an environment that rewarded conformity and punished difference, and that the one domain in which she found genuine competence and genuine relief was a digital one, a world she could build and navigate on her own terms. When Chelsea was about 13, her parents divorced. The divorce was not a clean break, but the formal acknowledgement of a household that had already been fracturing for years. Susan Manning, struggling with her drinking and the practical difficulties of a life in a country far from her own family, decided to take Chelsea back to Wales. This was a significant displacement, the removal of a 13-year-old from the only environment she had ever known, from whatever friendships and routines had provided structure, and the transplantation of that child into a foreign country where everything from the accent to the social codes was different. Haverfordwest, in Pembrokeshire, is a market town of about 14,000 people, set on the western Cleddau River in the far southwest of Wales. It has a castle, built by Normans in the 12th century, that overlooks the town from a rocky promontory, an improbable piece of medieval architecture presiding over a very ordinary modern town. The landscape around it is beautiful in the Welsh way, green and often gray, with the Atlantic pushing in from the south and the light doing things that painters have always found worth recording. For a teenager already struggling with identity and belonging, arriving in this place as an American, or at least as someone perceived as American, added another layer of displacement to a life already characterized by it. Chelsea attended school in Wales and found, predictably, that she did not fit there either. Her accent was American, or some blend of American and Oklahoman that marked her as an outsider to Welsh schoolchildren. She spent a good deal of those years navigating the compound difficulty of being a foreigner navigating British secondary school culture, while simultaneously managing the private crisis of her own developing sense of identity. The question of gender, of a persistent, growing awareness that the body she inhabited and the self she experienced were not aligned in the way the world assumed they should be, had been present since childhood, though it would not have language until later. In Wales, as in Oklahoma, it was a secret she kept because the alternatives were unthinkable. She was smart enough to continue teaching herself whatever the school system either could not or would not offer. The internet was expanding rapidly in those years, and Chelsea discovered in it a world that her geographic isolation could not limit. She read voraciously politics, history, computer science, philosophy. She developed strong opinions about the way power operated, about the gap between official accounts of events and what the evidence suggested had actually occurred. She found online communities of people who were interested in similar things, people who understood the code underlying the systems of the world as she understood the code underlying her computer, people for whom the act of looking past the interface to the logic beneath was both a skill and a calling. Her mother's drinking worsened in Wales. The household was unstable in the way households organized around addiction are unstable. Functional on the surface for periods, then catastrophically disrupted, then functional again. Susan Manning would end up receiving treatment and would stabilize eventually, but the years of Chelsea's adolescence in Haverfordwest were years of managing a parent whose condition was itself unmanageable. By the time Chelsea was in her late teens, the situation in Wales had become untenable, and she returned to the United States to live with her father in Oklahoma City. Brian Manning had remarried. His new wife and Chelsea did not find a natural ease with each other, and the arrangement in Oklahoma City was never quite comfortable. Chelsea finished school as best she could, worked a series of minimum wage jobs, a software store, a smoothie shop, and found herself in her late teens in a position that many young people of limited resources and unclear prospects recognize. Smart enough to know what the world could offer, positioned poorly to access any of it. She was working jobs that engaged nothing, living in circumstances that provided nothing, and carrying a sense of herself as someone who had always been slightly out of place in every place she had ever been. It was her father who suggested the Army. Brian Manning, the former Navy intelligence analyst, believed that military service had given him structure and direction at a similar point in his life. He believed it might do the same for his daughter. His son, in the accounting of those years, before Chelsea had found or spoken the language of who she actually was. The military offered a salary, healthcare, education benefits, and the possibility of a career path. It offered a way out of the smoothie shop and the Oklahoma City apartment and the accumulating stasis of a life going nowhere. It was not the only option Chelsea had ever considered. But in the autumn of 2007, with few viable alternatives and a father whose confidence in the path was louder than her own doubts, Chelsea Manning walked into a recruiting office and began the process of becoming a soldier. The United States Army in 2007 was an institution under pressure in ways that shaped the quality of people it admitted and the speed with which it processed them. 6 years into the war in Iraq and approaching 6 years into the war in Afghanistan, the Army was consuming personnel at a rate that created constant strain on its recruiting pipelines. The wars had been longer than predicted, more complex than predicted, more costly in human terms than the early optimistic briefings had suggested, and the soldiers who had gone in at the beginning were cycling through their second, third, and fourth deployments while the institution worked to sustain force levels that the volunteer military model had not been designed to maintain at this scale. Standards in some areas of recruitment had been adjusted pragmatically to keep the numbers viable. Waivers were granted for conditions and backgrounds that might have been disqualifying in an earlier era. The Army needed people, and it was finding them where it could. Chelsea Manning enlisted on October 2, 2007. The process began with the standard intake sequence: physical examination, written aptitude testing, background review, the swearing of an oath that most recruits understand as ceremonial until the weight of it becomes real. What the aptitude testing revealed was not surprising to anyone who had known Chelsea for more than an hour. Her scores on the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, the standardized test used to determine what kinds of military roles a recruit is suited for, were strong across almost every category and exceptionally high in the domains related to information technology and analysis. The Army had a system for people with these scores, and it pointed them toward a specific career field. The military occupational specialty designated 35 Fox, intelligence analyst, was exactly what the label suggested. The job required a soldier to gather, process, and synthesize information from multiple intelligence sources and produce assessments that could guide the decisions of commanders in the field. It was analytical work, desk work in the military sense, requiring a combination of technical facility, pattern recognition, and the ability to hold large amounts of contextual information in working memory simultaneously. It was, in other words, a role that had been designed, without the designers knowing it, for someone with Chelsea Manning's particular cognitive architecture. She was assigned to train as a 35 Fox. Basic training would come first. Fort Leonard Wood, in the Missouri Ozarks, is the installation where Army basic combat training was conducted for certain military occupational specialties in 2007. It sits in a part of Missouri that is geographically beautiful in a rugged, wooded way and climatically brutal in the specific manner of the American interior, oppressively hot in summer, genuinely cold in winter, simultaneously humid and dry in ways that seem contradictory until you have lived them. The training itself is designed to do several things simultaneously: build physical fitness, instill discipline, break down the individual identity that recruits bring from civilian life and replace it with a collective one oriented around the unit and the mission, and habituate new soldiers to operating effectively under conditions of stress, sleep deprivation, and sustained discomfort. Chelsea found basic training difficult in the ways that basic training is designed to be difficult, and more difficult in the specific ways that her frame, slight, physically not imposing, created in a training environment where physical capacity was the baseline currency of credibility. She was not a natural soldier in the athletic mold. She struggled with some of the physical requirements. There were incidents during that period that surfaced years later in court proceedings. Altercations, difficulties in the social dynamics of barracks life, a punch thrown that caught the attention of unit leadership. The picture that emerges from accounts of her training period is of a person who possessed real intellectual ability, who could absorb and process information quickly, but who chafed against the particular social order of military culture, and who did not always find effective ways to manage conflict in an environment that had very specific and unforgiving norms for how conflict was supposed to be handled. There were discussions at various points about whether Manning was suited for continued service. She was held back during training and had to repeat portions of the basic training sequence. The process of getting through it and into her actual specialty training was not smooth. But she persisted, and eventually she moved on to the next phase. The specialized training that would give her the access and the skills that would later change the world. Fort Huachuca sits in the high desert of southeastern Arizona, in the Huachuca Mountains at an elevation of about 4,700 feet above sea level, where the air is dry and clear and the sky at night is remarkable. It is the home of the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence, which is the institution responsible for training the Army's intelligence professionals, analysts, collectors, counterintelligence agents, and the specialists who support all of them. If the Army needed a central location where the craft of handling secrets was taught to the people entrusted with handling them, Fort Huachuca was it. Manning arrived there in the late winter of 2008 and entered a world that would prove to be a far more natural fit for her abilities than the physical gauntlet of basic training had been. The training for a 35 Fox analyst covered a substantial amount of ground. Students were taught the fundamental classifications of intelligence: human intelligence gathered from people, signals intelligence gathered from intercepted communications, imagery intelligence gathered from aerial and satellite surveillance, and the various analytical frameworks that organize these streams into coherent assessments. They were introduced to the databases and networks that the modern intelligence apparatus used to store and share information, and they were trained in the specific protocols governing the handling of classified material, the rules about who could see what, under what circumstances, using what authorizations. They were taught, in short, both the technical mechanics of the job and the ethical and legal framework surrounding it. Manning was a strong student in the analytical portions of her training. Her processing speed, her ability to identify patterns in large datasets, and her facility with the software systems she was being taught all stood out. Her instructors at Fort Huachuca would later note that she had genuine ability as an analyst, the kind of synthetic intelligence that could take information from multiple disparate sources and construct a coherent picture of what was actually happening in the field. These were not merely rote skills. They required a particular kind of mind, and Manning had that mind. What the training at Fort Huachuca also provided, though this was not its explicit purpose, was an introduction to the scope and nature of what the United States government knew and was doing in the places where American power was being exercised. The training was necessarily somewhat abstract. It was preparing analysts for a job rather than giving them the actual job, but the systems they were trained on, the databases they were shown, the categories of information they were taught to handle, all of it gestured toward the vastness of the enterprise. The intelligence community of the United States in 2008 was, by almost any measure, one of the largest and most sophisticated information-gathering operations in human history. The volume of material flowing through the systems that Manning was being trained to use was staggering. Daily, hourly, continuously updated streams of data from human sources, from satellites, from intercepted phone calls and emails, from drones flying over mountains and deserts. The training gave analysts a map of this territory. It showed them the pathways through it. It also, unavoidably, gave them a sense of the gap between what the public knew about the wars being fought in their names and what the classified record actually contained. Manning's security clearance, secret level with access to SIPRnet, was processed and granted during this period. This was the authorization that would, in another year, give her access to the databases at FOB Hammer. The clearance process involved a background investigation, review of financial records and personal history, and interviews with people who knew the applicant. The standard for a secret clearance was not the most intensive investigation the government conducted. That level was reserved for top-secret clearances with special access program authorizations. For a secret clearance, the process was designed to screen for obvious disqualifying conditions, criminal history, financial vulnerabilities that might make a person susceptible to recruitment by foreign intelligence services, patterns of behavior suggesting unreliability. The investigation that cleared Manning involved standard checks that did not detect, and were not designed to detect, the inner architecture of her moral life, the growing intensity of her sense of justice and accountability, the questions she was already beginning to carry about the relationship between information, power, and the public interest. She graduated from her intelligence analyst training at Fort Huachuca in the late summer of 2008. She had orders to report to Fort Drum, New York, the home station of the 10th Mountain Division, where she would join the unit to which she had been assigned and begin the next phase of preparation, the unit-level training that preceded deployment. Fort Drum, in the northern part of New York State near the Canadian border, was a different physical environment entirely from the Arizona high desert, colder, greener, set in a landscape of lakes and forests that bore no resemblance to either Iraq or Afghanistan. But it was at Fort Drum that Manning would begin operating within an actual intelligence unit, doing actual analytical work, and encountering the first concrete instances of the information that would eventually become the material of the most significant leak of classified documents in American history. The 10th Mountain Division had a rhythm shaped by its history of repeated deployments. Units rotated through training cycles, deployment windows, and the compressed process of reconstitution that happened in between. Manning arrived as a junior analyst, the lowest rung of a hierarchy that had its own customs, personalities, and internal politics. She was not immediately fully integrated in the way that soldiers who have an easier social fit tend to be. But she was doing the work she had been trained for, accessing the systems she had been taught, and reading the material that flowed through them with the same absorption she had brought to every domain that genuinely engaged her. The deployment to Iraq was less than a year away. By the time she boarded the aircraft that would take her across the Atlantic and then across the Middle East to the country where her story would reach its turning point, she had already read enough of the secret record to understand that what she was about to encounter would not be easy to unknow. Manning arrived in Iraq in November 2009, assigned to the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division, at Forward Operating Base Hammer. The base sat in a wide, flat expanse of agricultural land east of Baghdad, in the part of Iraq that the military had designated Multinational Division Center, the area between the capital and the Iranian border, covering the provinces of Wazit, Babel, and parts of Diyala. The stretch of country that surrounded FOB Hammer was not the densely urban territory of Baghdad proper, but a landscape of date palm groves and irrigation channels, of small towns built from the same yellow-brown brick as the earth beneath them, of roads that looked ordinary until they did not. The base itself was a standard forward operating base construction. Concrete blast barriers stacked in the distinctive T-wall configuration, prefabricated buildings on gravel pads, a perimeter of wire and guard towers, and inside that perimeter the full apparatus of a modern military installation in a combat zone. The motor pool, the TOC, the dining facility, the medical station, the small cluster of internet terminals that constituted the soldiers' connection to the world they had left behind. The 10th Mountain Division had a long history in Iraq. Units from the division had rotated through the country since the invasion in 2003, and by 2009 the institutional knowledge was deep, the procedures established, the culture of the intelligence shop shaped by years of men and women who had done this work in this place. Manning came in as a junior specialist, 21 years old, assigned to work in the Tactical Operations Center where the intelligence function was housed. Her rank was specialist, her role was all-source analyst, and her position in the unit's hierarchy was roughly what you would expect of the most junior analyst in a shop staffed by people of varying experience levels. She was not running the room. She was one of several people sitting at terminals, processing information, turning raw intelligence product into something digestible. What distinguished her from her colleagues early in the deployment was not a problem with the work itself, but with the social ecosystem in which the work occurred. Military units are intensely social organizations, organized around cohesion and shared identity in ways that civilian workplaces rarely achieve or aspire to. The culture of an army intelligence shop in a combat zone combined the general military ethos, discipline, hierarchy, unit pride, with the specific subculture of the intelligence community, which tended to attract people of a particular intellectual bent who were proud of their access to information others could not see. Within this culture, Manning struggled. She was small and slightly built in an environment that implicitly valued physical presence. She was eccentric in her interests and her conversational approach in an environment that rewarded conformity. She was, in a way she could not openly discuss with anyone around her, managing a profound personal crisis about her gender identity in an institution where the question of who she actually was could have serious consequences for her continued service. The don't ask, don't tell policy was still in force, and its logic extended in practice to questions of gender that the policy did not explicitly address but which the institutional culture policed no less vigilantly. She communicated with people outside the base through internet chat platforms and message boards, finding online the kind of connection that felt unavailable in the physical environment of the deployment. She had a loose circle of digital correspondents, people in various parts of the United States and beyond who knew her, who exchanged ideas with her, who were aware of the growing intensity of her internal struggle. Her messages from this period, portions of which would later make their way into court proceedings, paint a picture of someone managing an enormous amount simultaneously. The demands of a military job, the constant low-level threat environment of a war zone, the private agonies of unresolved identity, and, increasingly, the moral pressure generated by the information that was constantly passing through the terminal in front of her. Because what Manning was reading day after day was not abstract. It was specific. The SIPRNet terminal at FOB Hammer was a window into the classified record of two wars, and the classified record looked significantly different from the public record. Manning accessed it all, not only the intelligence products directly relevant to her unit's area of operations, but the broader sweep of material that SIPRNet made available to anyone with her credentials and access level. She was curious and she was thorough, and she had the processing capacity to absorb an enormous volume of material quickly. She read diplomatic cables from American embassies around the world, which contained candid assessments of foreign governments and foreign leaders that were fundamentally incompatible with the public diplomatic postures the United States maintained. She read operational reports from the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters that logged incidents in the field with a clinical precision that stripped away the language of official statements and left the raw arithmetic of what had actually happened. The Significant Activities Database, known in the military by the shorthand SIGAX, was a continuous log of significant events in the field. Every engagement, every improvised explosive device, every instance of air support requested, every civilian death, every detention, every patrol that made contact with hostile forces was logged in this system. The logs were written in military shorthand, stripped of the moral weight that the events they described actually carried, reduced to alphanumeric codes and grid references and casualty counts. But if you read enough of them, if you held enough of them in context simultaneously, the picture that emerged was of a war that was being conducted at a cost in civilian life that the public record had not disclosed. The official death counts and casualty figures released by the military did not match what the SIGAC logs showed. The gap between the two was not marginal. It was substantial. Manning read the Iraq SIGAC logs in the thousands. 400,000 entries, covering the period from January 2004 through December 2009. Nearly 6 years of the war in Iraq, cataloged in granular detail she could access from her workstation at FOB Hammer. She read the Afghanistan SIGAC logs as well, covering a period from 2004 through 2010. Combined, these two databases constituted something close to a complete operational archive of both wars as experienced from the inside, at the level of action in the field rather than the level of policy in Washington. They contained the material that no press briefing had disclosed and no Freedom of Information request had produced. They were the architecture of the secret war, and Manning could see all of it. The diplomatic cables added another dimension. The State Department cables that flowed through SIPRNet ran to over 250,000 documents, covering virtually every corner of American foreign policy and every country in which the United States had diplomatic representation. In these cables, American diplomats and intelligence officers described the behavior of foreign officials with a frankness that would have been politically catastrophic had it been made public. Assessments of world leaders that were sometimes contemptuous, sometimes admiring, sometimes simply tactical, but always written in the confidence that they would never be read by the subjects or the public. The cables described meetings that did not appear in official readouts. They described pressures applied through channels not acknowledged in public. They described the gap between what the United States said it was doing in the world and what it was actually doing, as experienced by the people doing it and recorded in real time. There was also the Guantánamo material. The detainee assessment briefs for the men held at Guantánamo Bay in Cuba, classified files that described the basis for each detention, the interrogation history, the intelligence value assessed, the recommendation for continued detention or transfer or release, were accessible through the secure networks Manning used. These files told the story of Guantánamo from the inside, including the fact that many of the men held there had been assessed as having little or no intelligence value, including the conditions under which intelligence had been extracted, including the internal deliberations of the men and institutions making decisions about human beings held without trial for years. The accumulation of all of this information, over weeks and months at FOB Hammer, had an effect on Manning that was more than intellectual. She had been trained to process intelligence without what the field called mirror imaging, the mistake of projecting your own emotional and moral framework onto the material you were analyzing, rather than analyzing it objectively. She had been taught the discipline of the analyst, which was to see clearly and report accurately and not let feeling distort perspective. But there is a limit to how long a conscientious person can read the gap between the official story and the internal record without that gap becoming intolerable. Manning was reaching that limit. She was also, during this same period, experiencing a deterioration in her professional situation. There were incidents in the intelligence shop, arguments, a physical altercation that resulted in her being temporarily moved to a different assignment, concerns expressed by her chain of command about her emotional stability and her reliability. These concerns were legitimate in the immediate operational sense. A soldier who was visibly struggling, who was having conflicts with colleagues, who was exhibiting signs of significant psychological distress, was not operating at full effectiveness and was a liability to the unit in ways that unit leadership was right to take seriously. The concerns did not, however, prompt the kind of intervention, mental health support, administrative adjustment, careful supervision, that might have changed what happened next. They prompted, instead, the continued assessment of whether Manning should be kept in the deployment or sent home, and in the meantime she remained at her terminal with her access reading. By early 2010, Manning was reading something she could not get out of her head. A video file, classified, that had been sitting in the Defense Department systems for nearly 3 years. It had been taken from an Apache helicopter gunship on the afternoon of July 12, 2007, over the new Baghdad district of eastern Baghdad. It was 17 minutes of cockpit camera footage. The crew in the helicopter had no idea that what they recorded that day would one day be watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. They had no way of knowing it. They were doing their jobs. July 12, 2007. The sun was already brutal at 9:30 in the morning over the new Baghdad district of eastern Baghdad. The city was deep into what would later be studied as the bloodiest summer of the Iraq War's middle years, the period of sustained sectarian violence that had driven population displacement and mass casualty events week after week until Baghdad had become, in certain neighborhoods, almost a post-human landscape. Streets emptied, houses abandoned, the rhythm of ordinary life suspended while men with guns sorted the population by sect and extracted the cost of belonging to the wrong one. The surge of additional American troops ordered by President George W. Bush had been underway since February. The additional forces were still working to establish control over the specific areas where the violence had been most concentrated. In the new Baghdad district that morning, American forces on the ground had identified what they believed was a group of insurgents in the area. Reports were coming in of activity that suggested hostile intent. 2 Apache AH-64 helicopter gunships, call signs Krasihorse 1-8 and Krasihorse 1-9, were put on station to investigate and provide support. The helicopters climbed to altitude and circled the area, their sensors turned downward on the streets and alleys of a neighborhood going about its morning. What those sensors showed was a group of people walking through a street, carrying what the helicopter crews interpreted as weapons. The identification of what people carried in Baghdad in 2007 was not always straightforward. The city was so thoroughly saturated with small arms that the presence of an AK-47 in a man's hands as he moved through a street could mean many things. But among the people visible to the Krasahorse crews that morning was Namir Noor el-Din, a 22-year-old Iraqi photographer who worked for the Reuters news agency. He was carrying a Canon EOS 1D digital camera with a long telephoto lens. He was accompanied by his driver, 40-year-old Saeed Shmaf, and several other individuals. Reuters had been informed by American forces that its journalists were in the area and had asked for their safety to be respected. From the altitude and angle of the helicopter, the long telephoto lens attached to Namir's camera could be mistaken by people primed to see weapons for an RPG launcher. The crew of Krasahorse 1 to 8 made that identification. The request to engage was transmitted up the chain. The authorization came back. At 10:07 in the morning local time, the helicopter opened fire with its 30mm cannon on the group of people standing and moving in the street below. The cannon is a weapon of devastating kinetic efficiency. The rounds it fires travel at close to 1 kilometer per second and are designed to penetrate armor. At the range and angle from which the Krasahorse crew engaged, the rounds turned the street into something that no one who has not experienced war should have to fully imagine. Namir Noor el-Din was killed. Saeed Shmaf was wounded and tried to crawl to cover. Several other people in the group were killed. The helicopter crew observed Shmaf moving and continued to request authorization for a follow-up engagement. Shmaf was in the street, clearly wounded, clearly unarmed, clearly trying to survive. A black van arrived. Civilians who had seen what happened and were trying to help the wounded man. The helicopter crew requested and received permission to engage again. The van and the people surrounding it were hit by the cannon. 2 of the people in the van, it would later emerge, were the children of the driver. Both children were wounded. They survived. Their father did not. The full sequence of events was recorded on the gunship's targeting camera. The footage ran to approximately 17 minutes and contained onboard audio, the voices of the crew identifying targets, requesting permission, receiving it, executing the engagements, and discussing the results in the clipped, adrenaline-edged communication of combat personnel doing what they had been trained to do. There was no malice in the voices on the recording in the simple sense of hatred. These were not men who had set out that morning to kill journalists. They were men who had made a series of identification errors in a combat environment where the consequences of those errors were fatal, and who had processed the events in the idiom of combat, where the moral weight of what is happening gets metabolized through the language of targeting and threat assessment. After the engagement, Reuters submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the footage. The request was denied. The official characterization of the incident described a firefight with armed insurgents. The deaths of the Reuters journalists were noted, regretted, and attributed to the fog of war. The army conducted an investigation and found no criminal violations. The families of the dead had no access to the footage. The public had no access to the footage. The footage existed in the language of classification as a piece of information whose unauthorized disclosure would cause damage to national security. Not because the footage showed anything that was actually a secret in a strategic sense, but because it showed something that was politically uncomfortable, which is not the same thing but which, in the administrative logic of classification systems, tends to produce the same outcome. The footage sat in the Defense Department's databases for nearly 3 years. Chelsea Manning found it in early 2010. She had not been specifically looking for it. She encountered it in the course of her routine analytical work, the way that a person reading through a large archive encounters a document that stops them because it demands to be read in a way that other documents do not. She watched it. She watched it more than once. She sat in the glow of her terminal in the prefabricated intelligence shop at FOB Hammer and watched the gun camera footage from Krasahorse 1 to 8 in the way that it is very difficult to watch something and then set it aside and continue as though you have not seen it. What the footage showed was not a tactical gray area. It showed people who were not engaged in hostile activity being killed at distance, with a weapon of enormous destructive power, on the basis of an identification that was plainly wrong, accessible to anyone who looked at the long dark cylinder attached to the lead figure's camera and considered the possibility that it might not be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. It showed a wounded man being fired upon as he attempted to crawl to safety. It showed a vehicle full of civilians responding to an emergency being destroyed. It showed the gap between the official account of the incident and what had actually occurred with the kind of clarity that footage provides and that written reports can obscure. Manning could also read, alongside the footage, the official record of the incident, the SIGACT entries, the investigation summaries, the denial of Reuters' FOIA request. She could see the two versions of the same event side by side. The version in the footage and the version in the official statements. They did not agree with each other in ways that were ambiguous or interpretable. They disagreed in ways that were straightforward. The official account said armed insurgents had been engaged following an exchange of fire with coalition forces. The footage showed no exchange of fire from the group on the ground. The official account said the journalists' deaths were tragic but consistent with the rules of engagement operating in a complex urban environment. The footage made it possible to watch, literally to watch, the sequence of decisions and actions that had killed them, and to evaluate those decisions against the facts on the ground as visible from the same vantage point as the crew making them. This is what classification is supposed to prevent. The experience of the public knowing what the public would think if it knew what the classified record contained. That calculation, that the footage, if seen, would produce a judgment about the conduct of the war that the government did not want produced, was the implicit logic of keeping it classified. Manning understood this. She had been trained in the logic of classification, had been told that the system existed to protect national security, had been taught to believe that the lines separating what could be disclosed from what had to be hidden were drawn for reasons that were serious and defensible. Sitting in that room watching the footage from Krasahorse 1 to 8, she struggled to find the national security justification for keeping it from the public. What she could find was a political justification, a reputational justification, a justification rooted not in the protection of lives or capabilities or sources but in the protection of an institutional narrative from evidence that contradicted it. She played the video again. And then she thought about Namir Noor-el-Din, who had been 22 years old, the same age Manning was in the winter of 2010, a photographer who had gone out that July morning to do his job. She thought about Saeed Shmaf, who had been wounded in the first burst of fire and had been in the street trying to survive when the crew requested permission to fire again. She thought about the man who had arrived in a black van to help a wounded person in the street, whose children had been in the vehicle. She thought about the Reuters FOIA request that had been denied. She thought about the official statement. Something in her had already been changing for weeks, under the accumulated weight of everything she had been reading. The Krasahorse footage did not create her conviction that the information she had access to needed to be made public. Crystallized it. There is a difference. A conviction can be growing for months before it finds the precise point of focus that makes it actionable. This was that point. Manning had already been thinking about where she might take what she knew. She had already been looking at the landscape of options available to someone in her position. The video narrowed those options by sharpening the urgency. The question of what to do with what she knew became, after watching the footage from New Baghdad, a question she could not continue deferring. The decision Manning was beginning to form was not one that arrived cleanly or without resistance. It was the product of weeks of reading and thinking, of absorbing the classified record against the background of what the public knew about the same events, and of measuring, with increasing precision, how large the gap between those two versions of reality actually was. The Krasahorse video was the sharpest single point of that gap, the moment where the divergence between official narrative and documented fact was most viscerally legible. But the video did not exist in isolation. It was one data point in a much larger accumulation. Manning had been reading the Iraq War SIGACT logs, the operational field reports, with the systematic thoroughness of an analyst who was not merely processing information for use but who was beginning to understand the information as something that required a different kind of analysis. The question was not, for these purposes, who was in which grid square on which day. The question was what the aggregate picture told about a war that the American public had been experiencing through the mediation of official statements and embedded press coverage, and the particular filter of a government that had strong institutional interests in controlling how the war was perceived. The SIGACT logs told a story of civilian casualties that was substantially larger than the numbers the Department of Defense had publicly disclosed. The official position of the department throughout the Iraq War was that the military did not maintain counts of Iraqi civilian deaths, that such counting was beyond the scope of the military's operational accounting. This position had been publicly stated by multiple senior officials, including Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and had been repeated often enough that it had become the accepted framework within which journalists and policymakers discussed the civilian cost of the war. What the SIGACT logs showed was that the military did, in fact, maintain detailed records of civilian casualties, that every engagement that resulted in civilian deaths or injuries was logged in the database, and that the totals derived from those records were significantly higher than the public record suggested. Independent researchers who had spent years attempting to track the civilian death toll in Iraq had been dismissed or ignored by the government on the grounds that their methodology was unverifiable. The SIGACT logs demonstrated that the government's own methodology, its own record-keeping, produced numbers in the same range as the researchers' estimates. The official position that civilian casualties could not be quantified was not, as the logs showed, a reflection of the limits of military record-keeping. It was a policy choice about what to disclose. Manning also read carefully through the diplomatic cable traffic that SIPRNet made available. The cables covered everything from strategic assessments of the Iranian nuclear program to the pedestrian logistical arrangements for diplomatic receptions, and they were notable as a class of document for the gap they revealed between what American officials said in public and what they wrote in private. American diplomats were generally candid in their cable traffic in a way that public statements explicitly avoided being. Candid about the personal characters of foreign leaders, about the vulnerabilities and leverage points in bilateral relationships, about the transactions that occurred in diplomatic negotiation that could not be acknowledged in front of cameras and microphones. This was, in one sense, exactly what diplomatic cable traffic was supposed to contain. The system existed precisely because diplomats needed a channel for communicating with Washington that was insulated from disclosure, and that insulation was supposed to enable the kind of frank exchange that was impossible in public channels. But when Manning read those cables in 2010, the question she was bringing to them was not whether they served the legitimate functions of diplomacy. The question was whether the gap between the official public record of American foreign policy and the internal record visible in the cable traffic was a gap that the people on whose behalf that foreign policy was conducted had any right to know about. The cables described American pressure on foreign governments that was not reflected in public accounts of those relationships. They described assessments of political situations in foreign countries that shaped American decisions in ways that were not publicly disclosed. They described, in some cases, actions taken in the name of American foreign policy that were directly at odds with the public positions those same officials were defending in interviews and congressional testimony. There was a cable from the American Embassy in Reykjavik, Iceland, describing private communications between Icelandic officials and American pressure relating to bank failures and international financial obligations after the 2008 financial crisis. Pressure that the Icelandic government had publicly denied receiving. There were cables from Yemen, coordinating between American officials and Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh regarding American drone strikes on Yemeni territory, in which Saleh agreed to publicly claim responsibility for strikes that were actually being conducted by the United States. There were cables describing the personal financial behavior and private conduct of foreign leaders in terms that would have been career-ending for those leaders had they become public. There were cables from the American Embassy in Tunisia documenting the corruption of the Ben Ali family in language so specific, the names of family members, the amounts, the mechanisms, that it read like a prosecution brief. Manning was not reading all of this as a neutral analyst processing information for operational use. She was reading it as a person who had already made a preliminary assessment about the relationship between this information and the public, and who was now accumulating evidence for a conclusion whose moral logic she had largely already accepted. She discussed what she was thinking, obliquely in online conversations, not disclosing classified specifics, but articulating the framework through which she was beginning to interpret what she was seeing. She wrote that she wanted people to see the truth about what was happening, that she believed the American public had a right to the information that was being withheld from them, that the concept of classification had been extended beyond any plausible definition of national security necessity and was being used to protect institutions from accountability rather than to protect the country from harm. The question of where to take the information was not one with an obvious answer. Manning did not, at the outset, have WikiLeaks in mind. Her initial instinct was toward the established press, the major newspapers and news organizations whose function in a democracy included, in theory, exactly this kind of material, significant information in the public interest that official channels were concealing. She attempted to make contact with the Washington Post through the newspaper's general online contact channels in late 2009. The response she received, if she received one at all, was either non-committal or non-existent. She attempted the same with the New York Times, using a general phone number and describing, in terms necessarily vague, that she had information of significant public interest relating to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The person she spoke with at the Times gave her no indication that the newspaper understood the magnitude of what she was describing or was positioned to act on it. This is a moment worth pausing on, because the failure of the established press to respond to Manning's initial approach was not a minor footnote. It was a structural revelation. The major American newspapers had evolved, over the decades following the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, into organizations with substantial legal and institutional complexity attached to their intelligence sourcing. The legal exposure associated with receiving and publishing classified material had become a factor in editorial decision-making, not necessarily decisive but influential. The pathway between a potential source and a reporter who could actually evaluate the material required navigating organizational layers that were not designed for the kind of rapid, high-volume, high-sensitivity disclosure that Manning was contemplating. Whatever the reasons, whether institutional caution, the specific failure of the general intake systems to escalate the inquiry, or simply the strangeness of the contact, the established press did not take up the offer. WikiLeaks was different. It had been founded by Julian Assange in 2006 with an explicit mission that was precisely oriented toward this kind of material, classified and sensitive documents from governments and institutions that carried public interest, submitted through secure digital channels, published without the filters and legal hesitations that constrain the traditional press. By early 2010, WikiLeaks had already published significant material from other sources, a manual for the detention facility at Guantánamo, internal documents from Swiss banking operations, records from the Church of Scientology. It had demonstrated both the technical capability to receive and protect sensitive submissions and the editorial will to actually publish them. It was also, in the specific subculture of internet-savvy people interested in surveillance, secrecy, and the politics of information, well known. Manning knew about WikiLeaks. She visited the organization's website in January 2010 and read the submission guidelines. The submission process was designed to be anonymous and secure. Documents could be uploaded through an encrypted connection that was designed to protect the identity of the submitter. WikiLeaks had publicly stated that it could not be compelled to identify its sources because it did not technically know who they were. Whether that promise would survive the kind of pressure that the United States government could bring to bear was a question that Manning either underweight or chose not to focus on. The decision she was moving toward did not, by all available evidence, involve a sustained risk assessment of the personal consequences. It involved a moral calculation. The information needed to be public. This was the available means of making it public. She was going to use it. In early 2010, she began downloading files from the classified databases she had been using for months as a routine part of her analytical work. She used the same terminals, the same credentials, the same access she had been authorized to use since her deployment. She copied files to removable media. She had later described the process of copying data onto CDs that she labeled as music to avoid attention, and of downloading files while listening to Lady Gaga through headphones at her workstation. The gap between the enormity of what she was doing and the mundanity of how she was doing it is one of the stranger qualities of this story, that the largest leak of classified government documents in American history was, at the level of physical action, a person at a desk copying files while pop music played in their ears. The systems that were supposed to prevent this had not been designed for an insider with authorized access doing it deliberately and methodically. Julian Assange had spent the years before WikiLeaks becoming a person whose relationship to secrecy was philosophically adversarial. Born in Australia in 1971, he had been involved in the hacker communities of the 1980s and 1990s, arrested in Australia at the age of 21 for computer intrusion offenses, convicted on what was, by the standards of the conduct involved, a relatively modest set of charges and released without custodial sentence. He had moved through the overlapping worlds of cryptography, political activism, and digital publishing in the years that followed, developing a theoretical framework about the relationship between secrecy and power that he would later articulate in a series of essays and public statements. His central argument, stated plainly, was that authoritarian and corrupt institutions depended on secrecy to sustain themselves, and that the disruption of that secrecy, the forced transparency imposed by the publication of documents those institutions wanted kept hidden, was therefore a democratic and liberatory act. WikiLeaks was the organizational expression of that argument. The organization had been established in 2006 with a small team of volunteers and advisors spread across multiple countries, structured to resist legal pressure from any single jurisdiction. Its technical architecture was designed to protect source anonymity to the greatest extent possible given the state of cryptographic technology at the time, and its editorial approach was essentially one of radical publication. If material was of public interest and could not be demonstrated to cause direct and specific harm to identified individuals, it would be published. The traditional journalistic practices of source verification, editorial deliberation about the public interest and harm calculus of specific disclosures, and collaboration with governments or intelligence agencies to redact genuinely sensitive material before publication were, in the early WikiLeaks model, largely absent. Regarded by Assange as precisely the mechanisms by which establishments co-opted and neutralized the transparency function that a truly free press was supposed to serve. By the time Manning made her first approach to the organization in late January 2010, WikiLeaks had broken into broader public consciousness in several countries with a number of significant document releases. The organization had a submission portal, an interface built on top of cryptographic tools that were designed to strip identifying metadata from uploaded files and route the connection through anonymizing networks that made it difficult to trace the submitter. A person could upload a document to WikiLeaks without creating any centralized record of who had done it, provided they used the tools correctly and took the additional operational precautions the organization's submission guidelines recommended. For someone like Manning, who was technically literate and who was using classified systems for which she had legitimate credentials, the submission process was not technically demanding. She uploaded the Krasahorse footage first. The 17 minutes of gun camera video from July 12, 2007, compressed into a digital file, traveled through layers of encrypted routing and arrived in WikiLeaks submission system sometime in early 2010. She also transmitted supplementary materials, after-action reports, radio logs, documentation that provided operational context for the footage. The transmission of the video alone was a significant act. The Krasahorse footage was exactly the kind of material that WikiLeaks had been built to receive and publish, a classified document of undeniable public interest, directly contradicting an official account that the institution involved had maintained for nearly 3 years. But Manning did not stop at the video. The volume of material she transmitted to WikiLeaks over the following weeks and months was staggering in scale. The Iraq SIGACT logs, approximately 400,000 field incident reports covering the bulk of the Iraq War, were compressed and transmitted. The Afghanistan SIGACT logs, approximately 90,000 documents covering the Afghan theater from 2004 onward, followed. She transmitted the Guantánamo detainee assessment briefs, classified files on the approximately 800 men who had been detained at the facility, including the internal assessments of their intelligence value and recommended dispositions. And she transmitted the State Department cables, a collection of approximately 251,000 diplomatic communications from American embassies and consulates around the world, covering virtually every aspect of American foreign policy over the preceding decade. The physical logistics of transmitting this much classified material from a military base in Iraq to a digital submission portal without detection required the exploitation of the specific weakness in the post-September 11 information sharing architecture that had been identified by theorists long before Manning demonstrated it practically. The weakness of relying on training and trust rather than technical control to manage the behavior of insiders with authorized access. The SIPRNet terminals at FOB Hammer had not been specifically configured to monitor for large-scale downloads of the kind Manning was conducting. The base's information security protocols, like those at most forward operating bases, were oriented toward preventing external intrusion rather than internal exfiltration. The physical removable media she used, CDs, and a compact flash card at various stages, were not, in the practice of this particular installation, consistently monitored or controlled at the level that would have detected what she was doing. She was careful in her way. She listened to music while she worked. She labeled her disks in ways that would not attract casual attention. She was systematic, downloading sequentially through the databases she had access to, building a complete archive rather than cherry-picking individual documents. The systematic approach was in some ways riskier. A larger exfiltration was, in principle, more detectable, but it also reflected the nature of the project she believed she was engaged in. She was not trying to expose a single incident. She was trying to make available the full classified record of what had been done in the name of the American people, so that the people could evaluate it for themselves. The scale of the transmission was commensurate with the scale of the judgment she had made. Manning's communications during this period, the online messages she sent to correspondents outside the base, the chat logs that would later be central evidence at her court-martial, showed a person operating under enormous pressure and carrying an enormous secret, who was simultaneously frightened by what she was doing and resolved about why she was doing it. She wrote that she wanted people to see and hear what she had seen and heard. She wrote about the footage from New Baghdad, about Namir Noor-el-Din's camera being mistaken for an RPG, about the commentary of the helicopter crew, about the wounded man in the street. She was not clinical about it. The moral weight was present in the language. She understood what she was transmitting and why she was transmitting it, and the why was not complicated in her own accounting. She believed that the people who had the legal and moral authority over the wars she was helping to administer, the American public, were being denied the information they needed to evaluate whether those wars were being conducted in accordance with the values that justified fighting them. WikiLeaks processed the Krasahorse footage carefully. Assange and his colleagues recognized immediately that they had something of historical significance. A classified gun camera video from the Iraq War, contradicting the official account of a documented atrocity, with all the contextual documentation needed to establish its provenance and authenticity. The footage was not released immediately. WikiLeaks worked to analyze and verify the material to add context, to ensure that the release would have the maximum possible impact. They edited the raw footage into a more accessible form, adding captions identifying the individuals visible in the frame, including Namir Noor-el-Din and Saeed Shmaf, and adding explanatory subtitles to the audio communications between the helicopter crew. They titled the edited version Collateral Murder, a deliberately inflammatory framing that some journalists and media critics would later argue was an editorializing act that compromised WikiLeaks' claim to be a neutral publishing organization. On April 5, 2010, WikiLeaks published the Collateral Murder video at a press conference in Washington, D.C. The response was immediate and enormous. The footage spread across every major news platform in the world within hours. The combination of its subject matter, the killing of journalists, the firing on a van full of civilians, and its visceral immediacy, this was not a written account but actual footage, actual voices, actual shots, made it the kind of story that generated the specific shock of lived reality breaking through abstraction. People who had believed, in a general way, that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had produced civilian casualties now had 17 specific minutes of what that looked like, heard in real time from the people pulling the triggers. The American military and the Obama administration responded with a combination of acknowledgement and deflection. Officials noted that the incident had been investigated and found to be within the rules of engagement. They expressed regret for the deaths of the Reuters journalists while declining to use language suggesting that the engagement had been wrong or that the official account of it had been misleading. Reuters itself renewed its calls for a full review of the incident and expressed concern about the accuracy of the military's previous accounts. The parents of Namir Noor-el-Din, the young photographer who had died in the street, saw their son's death given context it had been denied for 3 years. Manning was still at FOB Hammer when the Collateral murder video went public. She watched the coverage of its release from the same installation where she had sat and watched the original footage a few months earlier. She had already transmitted enormously more than just the video. The SIGAC logs, the cables, the Guantánamo files were already with WikiLeaks, waiting for processing and release. The world was not yet aware of the full scale of what had been exfiltrated. That revelation would come later. For now, the Krasahorse video was proof that the system worked, that the information had traveled from the database to the organization to the public, and that the public had responded with the engagement and the outrage that the information warranted. She was also, though she did not yet fully know it, running out of time. The scale of what Manning had transmitted to WikiLeaks did not become publicly apparent all at once. It arrived in waves, each one larger than the last, and each release created a distinct shock to the global information environment before being absorbed and generating the next anticipation. The Collateral murder video was the first. It demonstrated the principle that classified material of undeniable public interest could travel from a government database to the public sphere through this new kind of publishing organization, with a directness and speed that the traditional press, with its legal cautions and editorial deliberations, could not match. The second wave arrived in late July 2010. WikiLeaks, working in coordination with 3 major international news organizations, the New York Times, The Guardian in Britain, and Der Spiegel in Germany, published the Afghan War Diary. This was approximately 92,000 documents from the Afghanistan SIGAC database, covering the period from January 2004 through December 2009, 6 years of the war in Afghanistan, as logged by American and NATO forces in the field. The simultaneous publication by 3 major newspapers alongside WikiLeaks was a deliberate strategy. By distributing the material to established journalistic institutions with the editorial infrastructure to analyze and contextualize, WikiLeaks gained both reach and legitimacy, while the newspapers gained access to source material whose scale and significance were without precedent. The Afghan War Diary revealed several categories of information that the official public account of the war had not disclosed. It contained documentation of a secret American-run task force known as Task Force 373, which operated outside the formal chain of command and was authorized to capture or kill high-value Taliban and al-Qaeda targets without the due process considerations that applied to regular military operations, a kind of shadow war running parallel to the acknowledged one. It contained records of hundreds of incidents in which Afghan civilian casualties resulted from coalition operations, casualties that had not been disclosed in official statements and that collectively added substantially to the known civilian death toll. It contained documentation of tensions between American officials and Pakistani intelligence services, including reports suggesting that elements of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate were providing support to Taliban commanders, a claim that official diplomatic discourse between Washington and Islamabad had carefully avoided making explicit. The Pakistani angle generated particular diplomatic turbulence. The United States government's public position on Pakistan was one of careful, necessary partnership. Pakistan was a critical ally in the Afghanistan campaign, a nuclear power on the Afghan border whose cooperation was essential to both the supply chain and the intelligence dimension of the war. Whatever American officials privately thought about the ISI's relationships with groups that were killing American soldiers, public statements maintained the posture of alliance and shared purpose. The SIGAC logs did not maintain that posture. They logged specific incidents, specific units, specific locations. The gap between the public record of American-Pakistani relations and the field-level documentation of what American forces were actually encountering was, once laid out across 92,000 documents, significant enough that it could not be addressed with routine diplomatic language. 3 months later, in October 2010, WikiLeaks published the Iraq War Logs. This was the larger of the 2 military archives, 401,000 documents from the Iraq SIGAC database, covering January 2004 through December 2009. The scale was staggering not just in volume but in what the aggregate revealed. The Iraq war logs contained records of 66,000 previously undisclosed civilian deaths in the period they covered. These were not statistics inferred from research methodologies that the government could challenge. These were numbers from the government's own reporting system, entries logged by American military units in the field, each one a specific incident with a location and a date and a casualty count. The total, when subjected to the kind of analytical work that the Iraq Body Count Organization applied to the full dataset, produced a civilian death toll substantially larger than what official American sources had acknowledged. The logs also documented in granular detail the practice of transferring Iraqi detainees to Iraqi authorities despite documented evidence that those authorities were using torture. Army Regulation 190-8 required American forces to halt transfers of detainees when there was credible reason to believe the receiving force would subject them to abuse. The SIGAC logs contained entry after entry, filed under a standing instruction that bore the ominously bureaucratic designation Frago 242, in which American forces had documented evidence of abuse by Iraqi security forces and had explicitly declined to investigate or intervene. The Frago 242 instruction, issued in 2004, directed that coalition forces were not to investigate reported detainee abuse by Iraqi forces. The Iraq war logs made the existence of that instruction and the scale of its application a matter of documented record rather than allegation. The third major release, and by some measures the one with the widest global impact, was Cablegate. Beginning on November 28, 2010, WikiLeaks began publishing the diplomatic cable archive that Manning had transmitted. Approximately 251,000 cables from 274 American diplomatic facilities around the world, covering the period from 1966 to February 2010. The release was, again, coordinated with a consortium of major international news organizations, this time expanded to include El País in Spain and Le Monde in France in addition to The Guardian, The New York Times, and Der Spiegel, and was structured as a rolling disclosure that parceled out cables by subject and region over months, allowing the journalistic partners to provide analysis and context alongside the raw documents. Cablegate caused diplomatic disruption in virtually every region of the world simultaneously. The cables from the Middle East disclosed that Arab leaders, including Saudi Arabian King Abdullah, had been privately pressuring the United States to conduct military strikes against Iran's nuclear program, a position in direct contradiction to the public postures of those governments, which maintained that they opposed military action in the region. The cables from Central Asia documented corruption in the governments of American-backed leaders in countries critical to the supply routes supporting operations in Afghanistan, with specificity that the State Department had carefully avoided in public. The cables from China detailed American intelligence assessments of internal deliberations within the Chinese Communist leadership at a level of confidence and specificity that raised immediate questions about the sourcing. In Tunisia, a single set of cables from the American embassy in Tunis played a role in the popular uprising that would, within weeks of the cable's publication, overthrow President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. The cables documented, in the specific and damning detail of first-hand diplomatic observation, the corruption and venality of the Ben Ali family, their appropriation of state resources, their personal enrichment, their contempt for the Tunisian population over whose lives they held power. The cables confirmed, with the authority of American diplomatic reporting, what Tunisian civil society had long known but had lacked documented proof of. Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia on January 14, 2011, less than 2 months after the cables were published. The Tunisian Revolution was the first domino of what would become the Arab Spring, a series of popular uprisings that reshaped the political landscape of North Africa and the Middle East. The relationship between the Cablegate releases and the Arab Spring is a matter of ongoing historical debate. The causes of those uprisings were deeply domestic and deeply rooted in conditions that had existed for years, but the role of the cables in Tunisia specifically is documented in ways that make the connection difficult to dismiss. In Washington, the diplomatic corps and the State Department were in a state of sustained crisis management. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made calls to foreign counterparts, reassuring them that the diplomatic relationships remained sound, that cable traffic was by nature frank, and that the candor of a cable did not represent the entirety of a bilateral relationship. The calls had to be made because the cables existed, and because the people who had been described in them had read what had been written about them. The king of Saudi Arabia, who had been quoted in a cable characterizing Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as Hitler, now had to maintain a public relationship with the United States government that had stored that characterization in a classified database and been unable to prevent it from becoming a newspaper headline. The Guantánamo detainee assessment briefs were published in April 2011, completing Manning's principal releases. The files on the 779 men who had been held at Guantánamo over the facility's history showed, in the government's own internal accounting, a picture of the detention program that was far messier and less defensible than official statements had suggested. The files showed that many detainees had been assessed as having low or no intelligence value, some as early as their initial processing at the facility. They showed that some detainees had been recommended for release internally but had remained incarcerated for years after those recommendations, with no legal mechanism to enforce the assessment that they posed no threat. They showed the evidence basis for specific detention decisions, in some cases thin enough that independent legal observers found it difficult to reconcile with any standard of due process, however generous. The full volume of what Manning had transmitted, military operational records, diplomatic communications, intelligence files, represented a catalog of decisions made by the most powerful government on earth, spanning nearly a decade of two simultaneous wars and the full geography of American foreign policy engagement. None of it had been obtained by espionage in the traditional sense of that word. None of it had been stolen by an adversary intelligence service. It had all been exfiltrated by a 22-year-old analyst sitting at a terminal in a prefabricated building in the Iraqi desert, working with the access she had been legitimately authorized to use for the purposes of her job. The technology that the post-September 11 intelligence community had built to share information efficiently had enabled, in one of history's more ironic outcomes, the most comprehensive disclosure of that same information to the public that any government secrets had ever experienced. In the spring of 2010, while the Collateral murder footage was still reverberating through newscasts and editorial pages, Manning made a decision that would end everything she had built and begin the process that would define the rest of her life. She reached out, through an internet chat session, to a man named Adrian Lamo. Lamo was, at the time, 30 years old, and he occupied a specific niche in the culture that occupied computer security and digital activism in the early 2000s. He had gained a measure of notoriety in the early part of the decade by breaking into the computer systems of major corporations, the New York Times, Microsoft, WorldCom, and others, not for financial gain but in the manner of someone demonstrating capability, proving a point about the inadequacy of security measures at institutions that were presumed to be secure. He had been arrested for his intrusion into the Times' system in 2003 and had eventually pleaded guilty to a single felony charge. The sentencing had resulted in a relatively lenient outcome, a fine, supervised release, no significant prison time, and he had parlayed his hacker notoriety into a kind of public identity as a security consultant and occasional journalist on technology topics. By 2010, Lamo was a complicated figure. He had disclosed to the authorities a mental health history that had led to a period of involuntary hospitalization. He had relationships in both the hacker community and the law enforcement world, a dual positioning that put him at an unusual intersection of the two. He wrote for small online publications. He was widely known in certain digital circles. He was not obviously the kind of person in whom you would confide secrets of the magnitude Manning was carrying. But Manning, who had been carrying those secrets for months in a condition of intense isolation, made the choice to reach out to him. The conversations between Manning and Lamo, conducted through AOL Instant Messenger in late May 2010, constitute one of the more remarkable documents in the history of this case. They were later published in full, first by Wired magazine, which obtained them from Lamo, and subsequently by many other outlets, and they capture Manning in a state of raw emotional exhaustion, articulating the moral reasoning behind her actions with a directness that was both unusually self-aware and unusually vulnerable. She explained what she had done. She explained why she had done it. She described the footage, described the cables, described the process of watching the gap between the classified record and the public record and finding it intolerable. She said she wanted people to see the truth about what the United States was doing in the world. She said she hoped it would spark debate, that she hoped people would examine the decisions that were being made in their names with the same information that decision-makers were using. She also disclosed that she had ongoing access to the SIPRNet systems, that she had transmitted hundreds of thousands of documents, and that the most politically significant of the material she had transmitted was the State Department cable archive. She asked Lamo whether he would keep the conversation confidential. He said that he would treat it with the same confidentiality as a priest would a confession. Lamo then contacted the FBI. The decision Lamo made has been contested and debated at length in the years since. He explained it in various ways in the interviews and articles that followed, that he believed Manning, who had disclosed the ongoing nature of her access to classified systems, represented a continuing security risk, that he was concerned about the potential for harm from the release of so much classified material, that he believed he had a patriotic obligation to disclose what he had been told. His critics, and they were numerous, and some were vicious in their public assessments of his conduct, argued that he had broken an explicit promise of confidentiality and had betrayed someone who had trusted him, that his motivations were self-serving, that the outcome of his actions included the pretrial detention of a person whose legal treatment would later be described by a United Nations official as cruel and degrading. The FBI acted quickly. On May 26, 2010, Lamo provided the Army Criminal Investigation Command and the FBI with the chat logs from his conversations with Manning. The chat logs contained Manning's name, her unit, her location, and a detailed account of what she had transmitted and to whom. The identification and location of the source of the WikiLeaks materials, which had been a matter of active investigation since the Afghan and Iraq databases had been flagged as compromised, was suddenly straightforward. On May 27, 2010, Manning was arrested at FOB Hammer. She was 22 years old. She had been in Iraq for about 6 months. The specific charge at the moment of arrest was about the unauthorized transmission of classified information, but the investigation that followed would expand that accounting considerably as agents worked through the full scope of what had been transmitted and developed the legal theory that the prosecution intended to pursue. The arrest did not stop WikiLeaks from publishing. The Afghan War Diary went public in July 2010, 2 months after Manning was in custody. The Iraq war logs followed in October. Cablegate began its rolling publication in November. The mechanism had been in motion before Manning was caught, and it could not be halted by her arrest because the material was already in the possession of the publishing organization and its journalistic partners. This would become a significant point in the legal and political debate that followed. The government could charge and try Manning, but it could not unpublish the material, could not retrieve the information that was by then in the possession of major newspapers in 5 countries, could not prevent the diplomatic cables from reaching the governments and heads of state who had been described in them. The discovery and arrest also drew the attention of federal investigators to Lamo's own role in the affair, an irony he had apparently not fully anticipated, since his own computer intrusion history and the murky legal status of his discussions with Manning made him a potential subject of scrutiny as well as a cooperating witness. That scrutiny did not ultimately result in charges against him, and he remained in the peculiar position of being simultaneously celebrated in some quarters as a patriot who had prevented harm and condemned in others as a traitor to the community whose codes of loyalty he had violated. For Manning, the arrest closed the operative phase of what she had set out to do. She had transmitted the material. It had been received. It was in the process of being published. The question of whether what she had done was right or wrong, legal or criminal, heroic or treasonous would now be decided in places and through processes that were not within her control. She was in the Army's custody. The world that her disclosures were gradually revealing would have to process what it was being shown without her present to explain her reasoning in person. The chain of events she had set in motion was continuing without her. It would continue for months and years, changing governments, informing investigations, triggering diplomatic crises, shaping the terms of debates about privacy and surveillance and the rights of journalists that would occupy public life for the next decade and beyond. The most immediate question in the summer of 2010 was what would happen to her. After her arrest at FOB Hammer in May 2010, Manning was transferred to the detention facility at Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, an American military installation in the Kuwaiti desert that served as a logistics and support hub for operations in the region. She was held there for approximately 2 months, in conditions that were Spartan in the way that detention in a military forward area is Spartan. Not designed for long-term habitation, not equipped with the facilities or the programs that would have been available at a permanent brig installation. The legal process of determining charges and the administrative process of deciding what to do with her proceeded at military pace, which is to say that it proceeded in ways that were not always legible to her or to the people advocating on her behalf. She was transferred across the Atlantic in late July 2010, placed aboard a military transport and flown from Kuwait to the United States. Her destination was the Marine Corps brig at Quantico, Virginia, about 30 miles south of Washington, D.C. The brig was a permanent detention facility that had been used to house both military and federal civilian prisoners over the decades, and which in 2010 was one of the more secure detention facilities in the military prison system in the continental United States. Manning arrived at Quantico in the final days of July and began what would become nearly 9 months of pretrial detention in circumstances that would themselves become a subject of significant public controversy. The conditions under which Manning was held at Quantico attracted sustained international attention and generated specific diplomatic and legal criticism. She was placed under a prevention of injury status, a classification that the brig's officials described as a precautionary mental health measure, intended to reduce the risk of self-harm. Under POI status, Manning was confined to a single cell for 23 hours a day. She was required to remain in her cell even during the 1-hour daily period designated for exercise. She was not permitted to exercise within her cell in ways that might cause her to perspire. She was required to surrender her clothing at night, sleeping in only a garment designed to prevent use for self-harm. She was checked by guards at 5-minute intervals through the night, a procedure that required the guard to confirm she was awake and responsive each time, which meant that uninterrupted sleep for more than 5 minutes at a stretch was structurally impossible. She was not permitted access to a pillow or sheets. The POI designation was not, in the assessment of the physicians and mental health professionals who were brought in to evaluate Manning, clinically warranted. The brig psychiatrist recommended multiple times that the POI status be rescinded. Those recommendations were not acted upon. The status remained in place for the better part of Manning's time at Quantico, meaning she was subjected to conditions that her own prison's clinical staff did not consider necessary, for reasons that were never transparently explained to her legal team or to the public. The conditions at Quantico became the subject of a formal inquiry by Juan Mendez, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Mendez was a former political prisoner himself, having been detained without charge for 17 months in Argentina in the 1970s before his release was secured through international advocacy. His mandate from the United Nations Human Rights Council was to investigate and report on allegations of torture and cruel and degrading treatment globally, without geographic limit or exemption for powerful states. He requested access to Manning at Quantico to conduct a private interview, the standard procedure for his mandate. He was denied. He submitted written questions to the U.S. government. The government's responses were, in his assessment, inadequate. In March 2011, Mendez published a formal statement concluding that the conditions of Manning's confinement at Quantico constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment in violation of the Convention Against Torture. He specifically noted the impossibility of meaningfully sleeping through the night check procedure and the enforced idleness of the solitary confinement regime as particularly contrary to minimum standards of humane treatment. The American government disputed this assessment. The Pentagon maintained that the conditions were consistent with standard procedures for detainees held under prevention of injury status. State Department spokesperson Philip Crowley publicly described the treatment of Manning as ridiculous and counterproductive and stupid at a Massachusetts Institute of Technology event in March 2011, a candid judgment that he gave off the record but which was recorded and published. He was asked to resign and did so. The episode illustrated the simultaneous presence, within the Obama administration, of officials who privately judged the conditions of Manning's detention to be indefensible and an institutional commitment to maintaining those conditions without acknowledging their indefensibility. The advocacy that had begun to organize around Manning in the months since her arrest was building in scale and coherence. Support groups had formed. The most prominent was the Bradley Manning Support Network, organized by activists who had concluded that the pretrial conditions were a deliberate attempt to break Manning psychologically before a trial, to induce a state of psychological collapse that might yield cooperation against WikiLeaks or Assange. The support network raised money for legal defense, organized demonstrations, generated media coverage, and maintained a campaign of public pressure that kept Manning's case in public consciousness during the long period before any charges were formally presented or any court date was set. Her principal lawyer through much of this period was David Coombs, a civilian attorney who combined a background in military law with a genuine engagement with Manning's case, as one that involved significant legal and constitutional questions reaching beyond the individual. Coombs would become a central figure in the years-long legal process that followed, and his public statements and filings during the Quantico period represented much of the available public documentation of what was happening to Manning in detention. He challenged the POI conditions through military legal channels, arguing that they were unjustified by any clinical evidence and were causing harm to his client. Those challenges produced some eventual adjustments, but the fundamental conditions persisted until Manning's transfer from Quantico to the Military Correctional Facility at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in April 2011. The transfer to Leavenworth was an improvement in conditions by most measurable metrics. Manning was housed in the pretrial wing of the United States Disciplinary Barracks, the military's maximum security prison, in a less restrictive regime that allowed more time outside the cell, more access to programs and exercise, and the kind of social interaction with other detainees that had been essentially absent at Quantico. The extreme isolation of the Quantico period, widely considered to be the most psychologically damaging phase of Manning's pretrial detention, was over. But the detention itself continued. By the time Manning arrived at Fort Leavenworth, she had already been held for nearly a year without a trial. The military justice system operates on timelines that are structurally different from the civilian courts, and the sheer complexity of the case, the number of charges being prepared, the classified nature of much of the evidence, the preparation required by both prosecution and defense, meant that the path from arrest to court-martial was a long one. Manning would spend over 3 years in pretrial detention before her trial began. 3 years. That number requires a moment to absorb. She was arrested at 22 and would not face her accusers in a courtroom until she was 25. Having spent those years in military custody, most of them in a cell, the material she had transmitted, meanwhile, continued to reshape the world outside those walls. Every new WikiLeaks publication generated another news cycle. Every diplomatic revelation produced another response. The Arab Spring, which the Cablegate releases had in some documented respects influenced, swept through Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria. Edward Snowden, watching what Manning had done and what was being done to her, would later cite her case as part of the context in which he made his own decisions about the NSA surveillance programs he encountered at the NSA. The world was being changed by the information Manning had taken from a database in Iraq, and the person who had taken it was sitting in a cell in Kansas, waiting for the government that considered her a criminal to bring her to trial. The legal case constructed by military prosecutors against Chelsea Manning was, in terms of the sheer volume of charges, one of the most comprehensive criminal accusations brought against an American service member in the history of the military justice system. The government filed 22 separate counts against her, ranging across the spectrum of offenses that the Uniform Code of Military Justice provided for unauthorized disclosure of classified material. Working through those counts requires understanding something about how the prosecution shaped its theory of the case and why the most serious charge it brought was the one that attracted the most sustained public attention. The foundational charges were the sort that any prosecutor would bring against someone who had taken classified documents without authorization and transmitted them to an unauthorized party. Under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Manning was charged with multiple specifications of failure to obey a lawful regulation, specifically, the regulations governing the handling and safeguarding of classified national defense information. Under Article 134, she was charged with multiple specifications of wrongful wanton publication, transmitting defense information to persons not entitled to receive it. These charges were, by the standards of what had been proven, relatively straightforward. The government had the chat logs. It had the forensic evidence from the terminals at FOB Hammer. It had Adrian Lamo's testimony. The mechanical facts of what Manning had done were not seriously in dispute by any party. But the charges went significantly further. The government charged Manning under the Espionage Act of 1917, a statute that had been passed during the First World War to prosecute those who passed national defense information to foreign powers, and which had since become the principal legal instrument for prosecuting leakers of classified information to the press or the public. The Espionage Act's language is broad in ways that legal scholars have long found troubling. It does not require proof of intent to harm the United States, does not provide a clear public interest defense for defendants who believe they were serving the national interest rather than undermining it, and does not formally distinguish between transmitting information to an enemy government and transmitting it to a journalistic organization that published it for the general public to see. The use of the Espionage Act in Manning's case was not unprecedented, but it was a significant escalation. The Obama administration would use the Espionage Act against more whistleblowers than all previous administrations combined, a fact that civil liberties organizations tracked carefully and which journalists and legal scholars framed as a systematic effort to deter unauthorized disclosures of classified information through the specific deterrent of prosecution under a statute that carried severe penalties and provided defendants with almost no formal defenses. There was one charge, however, that stood above all the others in its severity and in the theoretical implications it carried for anyone who might ever disclose classified information to the press. The government charged Manning with aiding the enemy under Article 104 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The charge carried a potential sentence of death, though prosecutors subsequently confirmed they would not seek the death penalty, leaving life imprisonment as the maximum. The theory of the charge was this: Manning had transmitted classified information to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks had published that information on the Internet. The Internet was accessible to everyone, including Al-Qaeda and other designated enemy organizations. Therefore, Manning had knowingly given intelligence to the enemy. The implications of this theory, applied broadly, were significant enough that press freedom organizations in multiple countries raised formal objections to it. If the legal theory was accepted by the court, it established a precedent that any person who leaked classified information to any publication, any newspaper, any journalist, any online outlet, could be charged with aiding the enemy, because any publication accessible on the Internet is accessible to enemies of the United States. The theory effectively eliminated the distinction between leaking to a foreign intelligence service for payment and leaking to the press out of public interest conscience, treating both as legally equivalent acts of aiding the enemy. The Society of Professional Journalists, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and numerous international press freedom organizations submitted amicus briefs and public statements arguing that the aiding the enemy charge, if sustained, would have a devastating chilling effect on investigative journalism involving classified material, effectively making it legally equivalent to espionage for a journalist to receive and publish material of the kind that investigative reporters had been receiving and publishing for decades. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major news organizations that published classified material routinely in the course of their public interest reporting had a direct institutional stake in the legal question the aiding the enemy charge was designed to resolve. The preliminary proceedings in Manning's case, a series of Article 32 hearings that function in the military justice system as a rough equivalent of a civilian grand jury, consumed a large portion of 2012. At these hearings, the government presented its evidence and outline, and the defense had the opportunity to challenge the legal basis of the charges and contest the government's classification claims. The hearings were, like much of the legal process in this case, complicated by the classified nature of significant portions of the evidence, which meant that proceedings were periodically moved into closed session and that the public and press were excluded from portions of testimony that the government claimed involved classified material. What the Article 32 hearings revealed, beyond the mechanics of the legal process, was the shape of the government's case and the shape of the defense that David Coombs intended to offer. The prosecution's argument was primarily structural. Manning had taken classified documents without authorization and given them to a publishing platform from which they had entered the public domain. The volume was staggering, the access had been abused, and the potential for harm to national security was inherent in the nature of the information disclosed. The defense's argument was about intent and consequence. Manning had believed she was serving the public interest, had transmitted material to a journalistic organization rather than to a foreign power, and the government had not been able to document specific harm to identified individuals resulting from the disclosures. The harm question was one the government approached with considerable care and some difficulty. The Department of Defense, the State Department, and the intelligence community had each conducted reviews of the leaked material to assess the damage caused by its public disclosure. The results of those reviews were, to a degree that complicated the government's public statements about the severity of the damage, classified themselves. Officials said publicly that the damage had been significant, that sources and methods had been compromised, that lives had been put at risk. The specific evidence for those claims remained behind classification walls. As the legal process proceeded and as journalists and researchers began requesting that evidence through litigation, the picture that emerged was more ambiguous than the official statements had suggested. The government was not able to produce a roster of individuals who had been harmed as a direct result of the WikiLeaks publications. The claim that lives were put at risk was asserted repeatedly and sincerely by officials who believed it, but the documentation to substantiate the specific harm at the level required by legal proceedings was elusive. This was not, in itself, a complete defense. The potential for harm to national security from the disclosure of operational military records and human intelligence sources is real and does not require demonstration through specific individual cases to be legally relevant. But the absence of documented specific harm meant that the prosecution's narrative of catastrophe, the claim that Manning's disclosures had done irreparable damage of a specific and traceable kind, was difficult to support at the level of evidence rather than assertion. The defense intended to make use of this gap. By late 2012, the pretrial proceedings had established the framework for what would be a major trial at Fort Meade, Maryland, anticipated to begin in 2013. Manning was still at Fort Leavenworth, still waiting. The world outside continued to change in ways that were at least partly traceable to the information she had transmitted. The political arguments about WikiLeaks, about Declassified, about the First Amendment, about the Espionage Act, and about the specific moral status of what Manning had done had become central debates in American public life. The trial would not resolve those debates, but it would produce a verdict and a sentence and a legal accounting that would define in law, at least provisionally, what this person had done and what it was worth in years of a human life. The court-martial of Chelsea Manning began on June 3, 2013, at Fort Meade, Maryland, the sprawling Army installation that houses the National Security Agency and which sits in the flat suburban landscape between Baltimore and Washington. The trial was conducted in a military courtroom inside the installation, under military rather than civilian law, presided over by a military judge rather than a civilian one. Judge Denise Lind, an Army colonel with a career in military law that spanned 2 decades, had been assigned to the case as the military judge, the equivalent of arresting judge and trial judge in the military system, from the early stages of the pretrial process. She had already issued dozens of rulings on evidentiary and procedural questions before the first day of formal trial proceedings, and the contours of what the court would and would not hear had been substantially shaped by her pretrial decisions. The format of a court-martial is both familiar and distinct from its civilian counterpart. There is no jury in the civilian sense. The panel of officers who can serve as fact-finders in a court-martial is optional, and the accused has the right to elect trial by judge alone. Manning elected judge alone, a decision that legal observers analyzed extensively before the trial. The calculation, as best as legal observers could reconstruct it, was that a military judge would be more likely than a panel of career military officers to engage with the nuanced legal arguments the defense intended to present, particularly on questions of intent, harm, and the proper scope of the aiding the enemy charge. The choice of judge alone also reflected a calculation about the specific instructions and standards a panel would be given, and whether those instructions would allow the kind of carefully framed moral argument that Coombs intended to make. Manning had, in late February 2013, months before the formal trial began, entered guilty pleas to 10 of the 22 charges against her. This was a calculated legal move rather than a full concession. Manning entered guilty pleas to offenses she acknowledged having actually committed: the unauthorized taking and transmission of classified materials, offenses she had never substantively denied. By pleading guilty to these charges, she accepted legal responsibility for them and removed them from the contested portion of the trial. What she contested were the remaining 12 charges, most critically the aiding the enemy charge and several of the Espionage Act counts. The sentencing for the guilty pleas would be held over to be combined with the resolution of the contested charges, meaning that the admissions did not by themselves determine the total sentence. The prosecution's case, presented by a team of government lawyers led by Major Ashton Fine, was built around a straightforward structure. Manning had been trusted with access to classified systems, had broken that trust by exfiltrating material on an enormous scale, and had done so knowing that the material would be published publicly and would therefore be accessible to enemies of the United States. On the aiding the enemy charge specifically, the government presented evidence of Al-Qaeda's interest in WikiLeaks materials, including a document recovered from a computer belonging to Osama bin Laden after his death in the May 2011 raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan, in which Al-Qaeda had directed a researcher to search WikiLeaks for materials useful to the organization. The argument was that Manning could have reasonably foreseen that material published on a public internet platform would be accessed by enemies. The government also introduced evidence through expert witnesses on the potential intelligence value of the various categories of material transmitted, military intelligence officers who testified about the kinds of insight that the SIGAC logs, the cable traffic, and the Guantánamo files could provide to adversary organizations analyzing American military operations and American diplomatic positioning. The testimony was necessarily somewhat abstract in its specifics, since the classified damage assessments themselves remained under seal, but it served the government's narrative of harm, that the transmissions were not merely unauthorized but were genuinely dangerous. The defense's strategy, which Coombs had been developing and refining throughout the 3 years of pretrial proceedings, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the factual level, the defense argued that the harm the government was asserting had not been demonstrated with the specificity the law required, that assertions of potential harm were not the same as evidence of actual harm, and that the government had not produced the specific documentation it had claimed would show identifiable damage to national security. At the legal level, the defense argued that the aiding the enemy charge required proof that Manning had either communicated directly with an enemy or had knowingly given information that she specifically intended to reach an enemy, not merely that she had transmitted information to a publishing platform that happened to be accessible on the internet. At the moral level, and this was the argument that resonated most strongly in the public coverage of the trial, though it was legally the least powerful, the defense argued that Manning had acted out of conscience, for public interest reasons, in a manner consistent with a long tradition of American civil disobedience in which the defendant accepted legal liability for an action taken in service of a higher principle. The public conscience argument was legally complicated because the military justice system, like the civilian federal system, does not formally recognize public interest as a defense to charges under the Espionage Act. The law is structured to prevent defendants from placing the classification system itself on trial, from arguing that the information should not have been classified, that the public had a right to it, that the act of disclosure therefore served justice rather than undermining it. These are moral arguments rather than legal ones, and military courts are not constituted to render moral judgments of this kind. Coombs knew this. He deployed the moral argument not as a formal legal defense but as context, the kind of context that could influence a judge's assessment of intent and, ultimately, of the most serious charge. Several witnesses made testimony that proved significant to the case. Forensic experts traced the specific transmissions from Manning's terminal, establishing the documentary chain between her workstation at FOB Hammer and the WikiLeaks submission portal. Officers who had supervised Manning during her deployment testified about her performance and behavioral history in the unit, including the altercation and the concerns that had been raised about her psychological state. Manning's unit intelligence officer testified about the scope of her access and the nature of the databases she had used. The government declined to call Adrian Lamo as a witness in the trial proper, relying instead on the documentary evidence of the chat logs themselves. This was a calculated decision. Lamo was a potentially problematic witness, given the circumstances of his disclosure and the public controversy about his conduct, and the chat logs were self-authenticating documentary evidence that did not require his presence to be introduced. The defense did not significantly contest the authenticity of the logs, which again reflected the tactical reality that the facts of what Manning had done were not in serious dispute. Judge Lind heard testimony and argument for most of June 2013. The classified portions of the trial sessions addressing evidence that the government argued could not be discussed in open court were periodic throughout, and their existence was itself a source of tension in media coverage, since the public trial record was inevitably incomplete and journalists covering the case were aware that portions of the evidence were being heard outside their view. The defense made several formal challenges to the classification designations of evidence that it believed was being overclassified to prevent public scrutiny, and these challenges produced some partial successes in terms of forcing the government to justify individual classification claims, but the classified proceedings remained a feature of the trial throughout. By mid-July, the presentation of evidence was complete. Judge Lind closed the testimony phase and prepared to deliberate on the 12 contested charges. The verdict she was about to deliver would resolve the legal question at the center of one of the most consequential cases in the history of American military law, the question of whether an intelligence analyst who had transmitted classified material to a journalistic organization could be found guilty of giving aid and comfort to the enemy of the United States. On July 30, 2013, Judge Denise Lind delivered her verdicts on the 12 contested charges in the court-martial of Chelsea Manning. The courtroom at Fort Meade was full of journalists, legal observers, and advocates who had been following the case for 3 years. The verdict on the aiding the enemy charge came first. Not guilty. The 3-word finding on the most serious count against Manning sent a specific signal through the room and through the broader public that was following the case. The government's theory, that transmitting classified material to a publishing platform accessible on the internet constituted giving aid and comfort to the enemy, had been rejected by the military judge. Judge Lind's written findings, released subsequently, explained that the prosecution had not demonstrated that Manning had specifically intended for the material to reach an enemy of the United States, and that the mere foreseeability that published information might be read by adversaries was insufficient to meet the legal standard the charge required. This was, for press freedom advocates and civil libertarians who had argued that the aiding the enemy charge set a dangerous precedent, the most important legal outcome of the entire case. The precedent that any disclosure to a publication accessible on the internet could constitute aiding the enemy was not established. The line, however fuzzy and imperfect its location, between leaking to the press and leaking to an enemy was preserved. On the remaining contested charges, however, Judge Lind largely found for the prosecution. Manning was convicted of 17 of the 22 counts, including 6 charges under the Espionage Act, 5 charges of theft of government property, 1 charge of computer fraud, and multiple charges of failure to obey lawful orders. Combined with the 10 charges to which she had pleaded guilty earlier in the proceedings, the total was a finding of liability on 23 specifications of criminal conduct. The aggregate potential sentence under these findings ran to well over 100 years. The sentencing phase began immediately following the verdict. Both prosecution and defense presented additional witnesses and evidence specifically related to the question of what sentence was appropriate. The prosecution argued for a sentence sufficient to deter future disclosures, to communicate to the 3 million people who held security clearances similar to Manning's that this was what would happen to someone who chose to treat classified information as their personal property to distribute according to their conscience. The deterrence argument was explicit and unapologetic. The government was not primarily seeking to punish Manning as an individual. It was seeking to establish a price point for this category of conduct that would make future actors think very carefully before replicating it. The defense argued that Manning's genuine remorse, her psychological state during the period of the disclosures, the gender identity crisis, the isolation, the accumulated moral distress, and the evidence that no specific individuals could be shown to have been harmed by the disclosures should mitigate the sentence significantly. Coombs presented testimony from mental health professionals describing Manning's psychological condition during the deployment period, and from experts who had analyzed the WikiLeaks publications and concluded that the harm to national security had been substantially overstated by the government. He argued that a sentence of time already served, over 3 years in pretrial detention, or a sentence short enough to allow Manning to one day return to civilian life was appropriate. Manning herself read a statement to the court on August 14, 2013. In that statement, she apologized to the people her actions had hurt and took personal responsibility for the decisions she had made. She was visibly distressed. She did not repudiate the moral reasoning that had led her to the disclosures. She could not credibly have done so, but she acknowledged the harm that had resulted and expressed genuine regret for it. The statement was carefully crafted with Coombs' input, but the anguish in it was not performance. 3 years of pretrial detention, the conditions at Quantico, the weight of public attention, the sustained enormity of what she had done and what had been done to her in response. All of it was visible in the way she stood in that courtroom and read the words on the page she was holding. On August 21, 2013, Judge Lynn sentenced Chelsea Manning to 35 years in a military correctional facility, with a reduction in grade to private, a dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all pay and allowances. The sentence was the longest ever handed down in the United States for unauthorized disclosure of government information. It exceeded the sentences previously received by other high-profile Espionage Act defendants. It was the number the government had asked for, designed to register in the memory of every person with a security clearance as a concrete statement about what unauthorized disclosure would cost. The reaction to the sentence was immediate, polarized, and global. Human rights organizations condemned it as disproportionate, arguing that the length of the sentence was designed not to serve justice in Manning's individual case, but to intimidate potential future disclosures. Press freedom organizations expressed concern about the implications of the Espionage Act convictions for the relationship between government secrecy and journalism. Governments whose officials had been described in the Cablegate documents expressed a range of responses that ran from diplomatic silence to private satisfaction. A few governments, particularly those of countries that characterized themselves as committed to press freedom and whistleblower protection, made public statements expressing concern about the harshness of the American legal treatment of Manning. In the United States, the public divided along familiar lines. Those who believed that Manning had endangered lives and compromised national security found the sentence appropriate, even lenient given the original availability of the death penalty on the aiding the enemy charge. Those who believed Manning had performed a public service by disclosing information the public had a right to know found the sentence a legal instrument of retaliation against conscience. Petition campaigns calling for a presidential pardon attracted hundreds of thousands of signatures. Amnesty International declared Manning a prisoner of conscience, a designation usually associated with political detainees in authoritarian states, arguing that her imprisonment was primarily motivated by the government's desire to silence dissent and deter future disclosures. One day after the sentencing, on August 22, 2013, Manning's attorney David Coombs read a statement outside the courthouse that Manning had prepared. In it, for the first time publicly and on the record, Manning announced that she was a woman and had been living with the knowledge of her female gender identity since childhood. She said she wanted to be known from that point forward as Chelsea Manning and requested the pronoun she. The announcement was not a surprise to those close to the case, who had been aware of Manning's gender identity for some time, but its timing, the morning after the most consequential day in her legal proceedings, had a specific quality. Having spent 3 years in a legal process in which her public identity was defined entirely by what she had done, Manning was now asserting to the world who she was. The announcement generated its own significant media attention and its own significant controversy. The military prison system did not, in 2013, have formal protocols for managing the needs of transgender inmates. The question of whether Manning would receive hormone therapy at Fort Leavenworth became a matter of medical dispute and legal challenge that would last for years. The Army's initial position was that hormone therapy was not available to inmates within the military prison system. Manning's legal team challenged this, arguing that the denial of medically necessary care constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The case moved through federal courts. Judge Mark Wolf of the United States District Court in Massachusetts ordered the Army to provide Manning with treatment consistent with current medical standards for gender dysphoria. The Army complied. Manning began hormone therapy in 2015. The 35-year sentence settled over her like a weather system. She was 25 years old. She would be 60 years old when she was released, assuming no reduction for good behavior, no pardon, no commutation. The person who had sat at a terminal in Iraq and decided that the world needed to see what she could see now sat in a cell in Kansas, accounting for that decision at a rate of 1 year for every year that would pass. The United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, is the military's maximum security prison, located on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River about 30 miles northwest of Kansas City. The installation is one of the oldest continuously operated military correctional facilities in the country, with a history stretching back to the 19th century, and it carries the specific institutional weight of a place that has held soldiers convicted of crimes across every American conflict for over 100 years. The buildings are old in some sections and newer in others. The compound is surrounded by the kind of infrastructure that makes containment its physical language, and the daily rhythms inside it are the rhythms of incarceration, scheduled, monitored, bounded by the specific freedoms that the facility allows and the larger freedom that it does not. Manning arrived at Fort Leavenworth as a sentenced prisoner in August 2013. She had already been held at the facility's pretrial detention wing for over 2 years before the verdict. The transition to post-conviction status changed some administrative dimensions of her situation. She was assigned to a housing unit, given work assignments, allowed access to programming and educational opportunities within the facility's offerings. The years she spent in the sentence portion of her term were, by her own accounting, years in which she pursued education, read extensively, wrote, and attempted to build an interior life that could survive the physical confinement. The ongoing legal battles did not pause with the conviction. Manning's appellate team filed challenges through the military justice system's appellate process, arguing errors in both the conviction and the sentence. The appellate process in military law moves through the Army Court of Criminal Appeals and then, if necessary, to the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces and beyond. These proceedings would take years to resolve, and individual decisions along the way produced incremental adjustments to specific charges and sentence credit calculations without changing the fundamental picture. Manning was in prison, serving a 35-year sentence, appealing it through channels that offered no near-term prospect of significant relief. The fight for appropriate medical care continued simultaneously. The battle over hormone therapy had been won. She began receiving treatment in 2015, following the federal court order. The question of other gender-affirming care, including gender affirmation surgery, generated its own extended litigation. Manning's medical team documented that hormone therapy was insufficient to adequately treat her gender dysphoria and requested surgery as medically necessary. The Army's initial position was that surgery was outside the scope of care it was obligated to provide. Federal litigation on this issue was ongoing when it became moot for other reasons, but the general principle, that the medical needs of transgender inmates in military facilities were distinct and required specific accommodation, was being established through the litigation even as the substantive issue remained unresolved. The psychological dimensions of imprisonment over an extended period are beyond the capacity of any brief accounting to fully represent. Manning had been 22 when she was arrested, 25 when sentenced. The years from 25 onward in which she was in a cell at Leavenworth were the years in which most of her contemporaries were building careers, forming relationships, making the decisions that would define the arc of their lives. She had made the decision that defined the arc of hers years earlier, at a workstation in a desert in Iraq, and she was now living in the institution that decision had delivered her to. She communicated with the public through writing, through statements released by her legal team, and through a limited social media presence managed on her behalf. She was articulate and consistent. She did not express regret about the substance of what she had done, the disclosures, the decision to transmit the material to WikiLeaks, the belief that the public had a right to the information. She expressed regret for the harms that had occurred as a result. She continued to articulate the moral framework that had led her to make the disclosures, the belief that democratic accountability required information, that secrecy used to protect institutions from scrutiny rather than to protect genuinely sensitive capabilities was an abuse of the classification system, that she had acted out of conscience in a way she believed was necessary even knowing the consequences. She also attempted suicide twice during her imprisonment at Leavenworth in 2016. The attempts and the aftermath, the disciplinary proceedings initiated against her in consequence, the threat of indefinite solitary confinement as a penalty for the suicide attempts, generated significant advocacy and media attention. The American Civil Liberties Union, which had been involved in her legal representation since the Quantico period, issued urgent statements demanding that the Army provide appropriate mental health care rather than respond to suicide attempts with punitive isolation. The disciplinary charges were eventually withdrawn. In November 2016, Barack Obama was in the final months of his presidency, approaching the end of a two-term administration that had prosecuted more Espionage Act cases than all previous administrations combined, that had publicly declined to pardon Manning despite sustained campaigning by advocacy organizations, and that had maintained official positions on classified information control that were in fundamental tension with the transparency rhetoric that had characterized the early Obama campaign. Obama was also, in those final months, reviewing a substantial clemency list, the traditional presidential exercise of the pardon power that occurs at the end of every administration, in which cases that have not attracted sufficient political attention during the term of office get a final review. Manning's case was already on the clemency list. Her legal team had submitted a formal clemency petition. The advocacy organizations and legal scholars who had been arguing for her release had made the case that a 35-year sentence for disclosure of information to the press, disclosure that had not, by any documented measure, caused the specific catastrophic harm the government had predicted, was disproportionate, inhumane, and contrary to the democratic values that the American justice system was supposed to embody. They had argued that the conditions of her pretrial detention constituted a separate abuse for which no accountability had followed. They had argued that the gender-affirming care disputes had added additional suffering to an already excessive punishment. On January 17, 2017, 3 days before Donald Trump's inauguration and Obama's last full week in the White House, Barack Obama announced that he was commuting Chelsea Manning's sentence to time served plus 4 months. She would be released on May 17, 2017. She had served approximately 7 years, counting from her arrest in May 2010. The announcement generated the same polarized reaction the original sentence had generated, distributed across the opposite poles. Those who had spent years advocating for Manning's release received the news with relief and in some cases with tears. Veterans organizations and current military officials condemned the decision as undermining the deterrence the sentence was supposed to create, as sending a message that serious breaches of classified information security would not carry serious consequences, as a political act that disregarded the institutional interests of the intelligence community and the armed forces. Obama's outgoing press secretary characterized the commutation as reflecting the president's view that Manning had already served a significant sentence and that the original term was disproportionate. Obama did not grant a full pardon, which would have expunged the convictions. He commuted the sentence, which reduced the punishment without reversing the legal finding. The distinction mattered practically. Manning was released, but she remained a convicted felon with a dishonorable discharge, with all the civil disability that those designations carry. She was free from the cell but not free from the record of what had been decided in that courtroom 3.5 years earlier. She walked out of the United States disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth on the morning of May 17, 2017. She was 29 years old. She had been in military custody since she was 22. She had come into prison as Bradley Manning, had transitioned as fully as the institutional constraints allowed while incarcerated, and she emerged as Chelsea Manning, the person she had always been, arriving in a world that her disclosures had helped to change and that had spent years arguing about who she was and what she had done. The question of what came next had no obvious answer. She stepped out into the morning and began to find out. The world Manning stepped into in May 2017 was recognizably shaped by the information she had released 7 years earlier, though the shaping was distributed across events and debates that had developed their own momentum and did not always acknowledge the connection to their origins. The Arab Spring had risen and largely fallen, producing in most of its theaters outcomes more complicated and in several cases more catastrophic than the initial wave of popular uprisings had suggested. Libya had collapsed into factional conflict after the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. Syria had descended into a civil war of extraordinary brutality that had killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions more. Tunisia remained the qualified success story of the sequence, the birthplace of the uprisings, the country whose Cablegate-related exposure of presidential corruption had been the most direct link between the WikiLeaks publications and actual political change, had maintained a fragile democratic transition that was more durable than most observers had predicted in the aftermath of Ben Ali's flight. Edward Snowden had been living in Moscow since 2013, having sought asylum in Russia after disclosing the NSA's global surveillance programs, an act that Snowden himself described, in the years after, as partially inspired by Manning's example and by the understanding he had developed of the legal and institutional forces that would be used against someone who chose to bring classified information to the public. Snowden's disclosures had deepened and extended the public debate about state surveillance and privacy that Manning's work had begun, and the two cases were often discussed together as representing a new kind of public interest disclosure conducted by insiders with authorized access who made individual moral judgments about the public's right to know what was being done in their names. Julian Assange had been living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since June 2012, having entered the building to avoid extradition to Sweden on sexual assault allegations and having successfully claimed diplomatic asylum from the Ecuadorian government under Rafael Correa. He remained there through Manning's release and would continue to do so, in progressively deteriorating circumstances, until April 2019. WikiLeaks continued to operate during this period, releasing material from other sources, functioning as a platform with its own evolution and its own increasingly controversial relationships with actors whose relationship to the transparency principles the organization had originally espoused was not always straightforward. Manning herself, in the months after her release, moved through the process of reconstruction that follows long-term incarceration, the accumulation of the ordinary logistical infrastructure of civilian life, housing, documentation, healthcare, the practical rebuilding of a life from a point that most people encounter only in extreme youth, before the structures that sustain an adult existence have been built. She was 29 and beginning from near the beginning. She had supporters, an advocacy network, a public profile that was simultaneously an asset and a complication. She was one of the most famous people in the world in a very specific category of fame, the kind attached to a singular act rather than to an ongoing career or project, the kind that defines you entirely in relation to something you did years ago. She entered politics. In January 2018, Manning filed to run in the Democratic primary for the United States Senate seat in Maryland, challenging the incumbent Senator Ben Cardin. The decision attracted immediate national attention. Manning was not a conventional political candidate. She had no political career, no campaign organization, no obvious path to winning a general election in a state where she had no professional history. But her candidacy generated genuine engagement from progressive voters who saw in her the kind of principled, uncompromising politics that the conventional Democratic establishment was not offering. She ran on criminal justice reform, universal basic income, Medicare for all, and the broader platform of democratic socialist politics that was developing significant energy in the American left in the post-2016 environment. She shaved her head, wore clothing that was emphatically her own, and campaigned with an authenticity that did not accommodate the usual softening adjustments that political consultants recommend. She lost the primary. Ben Cardin won with about 81% of the vote. Manning received approximately 6%. The loss was not a surprise to political analysts, but it was a demonstration that the kind of fame her case had generated did not translate directly into electoral viability in a mainstream Democratic primary. The campaign had, however, demonstrated that she was not going to quietly withdraw from public life, that she intended to remain a public voice on the issues that had led her to make the disclosures in the first place. In May 2019, Manning was subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia that was investigating WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. She refused to testify, citing her principled opposition to grand jury proceedings, institutions she described as secret processes susceptible to abuse, and as part of the government's ongoing effort to build a criminal case against Assange and, by extension, against the practice of publishing leaked classified government information. She was jailed for contempt of court on March 8, 2019. She was held at the Alexandria Detention Center in Virginia, again in pre-hearing detention, again for refusing the demands of a legal process she judged to be unjust. She was released in May 2019 when the grand jury concluded its term without producing an indictment of its primary targets. She was subpoenaed again in July 2019 when a new grand jury was convened. She again refused to testify. She was again jailed for contempt. She remained incarcerated until March 12, 2020, when she was released after a federal judge concluded that her continued imprisonment was no longer serving any coercive purpose, that she had made absolutely clear that she would not testify regardless of how long she was held, and that keeping her in jail had therefore become punitive rather than coercive. The judge made this determination after Manning had attempted suicide while in custody in March 2020, an act that the court acknowledged reflected the unsustainability of the conditions she was enduring. 2 years before that second incarceration, the American legal landscape for the underlying issues her case had raised had shifted in ways that some earlier observers had considered unlikely. In April 2019, as a result of separate legal proceedings in the United Kingdom, Assange had been forcibly removed from the Ecuadorian embassy in London and arrested. The United States government had unsealed an indictment against him that included charges under the Espionage Act, the same statute under which Manning had been convicted. The criminalization of the act of receiving and publishing classified national defense information, conducted by an organization whose function was journalistic, was now formally manifest in charges against the publisher. Press freedom organizations around the world expressed alarm. The legal contest over Assange's extradition to the United States continued for years, running through the British courts, attracting intervention from heads of state, and producing a series of rulings about whether the specific legal protections for journalism in the United States would protect someone who operated outside the American mainstream press. What Manning's case had done, the specific legal, political, and cultural legacy it had left, was by 2020 too large and too dispersed to be traced to a single conclusion. It had shown that a single person with authorized access to classified systems could, in a matter of months, extract and transmit a volume of information sufficient to change the terms of multiple ongoing wars, trigger multiple government crises across multiple continents, and generate public debates that were still active a decade later. It had shown the structural vulnerability of information-sharing systems built on the assumption that insiders could be managed through training and institutional loyalty rather than through technical control. It had demonstrated, in the specific case of Tunisia and in the broader context of the Arab Spring, that the information contained in diplomatic and intelligence databases had the capacity to function as a political force when it entered the public domain, that the people over whom power was exercised had responses to the truth about that power being exercised, and that those responses could reshape governments. The legacy on surveillance policy was substantial. The Manning disclosures, followed by Snowden's NSA revelations in 2013, produced a sustained public and legislative engagement with questions about government surveillance, classification policy, whistleblower protections, and the First Amendment's application to classified information that had been largely dormant before 2010. The USA Freedom Act of 2015, which curtailed some of the NSA surveillance programs Snowden had disclosed, was a legislative product of the environment the disclosures had created. Congressional hearings, Inspector General investigations, and executive order reviews of classification policy were conducted in the years after both Manning's and Snowden's disclosures, and while none of them produced transformative reform of the classification system, they produced the kind of documented public scrutiny that the system had not previously experienced. The debate about what Manning did remains genuinely alive and genuinely unresolved, which is itself part of the legacy. There are serious people who argue sincerely and with evidence that the disclosures caused harm, that the exposure of intelligence sources and methods, the disruption of diplomatic relationships, the provision of operational military data to adversaries created real costs that cannot be dismissed as abstractions. There are equally serious people who argue sincerely and with evidence that the disclosures served an essential democratic function, that the public's ability to evaluate the conduct of its wars and its foreign policy requires access to information that classification systems systematically and in many cases unjustifiably withhold. These are not arguments that can be fully resolved in either direction, because they rest on value judgments about the relative weight of national security and democratic accountability that different people weigh differently and always will. What is not subject to meaningful dispute is the scale of what Chelsea Manning did and the scope of the consequences. In the compressed period of her deployment, from November 2009 to May 2010, she transmitted more classified information to the public than any individual in the history of American intelligence. She did it alone at a workstation in a prefabricated building in the Iraqi desert, for reasons she articulated with clarity and consistency before, during, and after her imprisonment. She paid for it with 7 years of her life, years that began when she was 22 and ended when she was 29, years that encompassed the most consequential period of her political and institutional engagement with the world she had grown up in and decided she could not leave unreformed. She came out of prison the same person she had been going in the ways that matter, the same values, the same convictions, the same capacity to bear the weight of a decision made on principle. The world the disclosures had helped to reshape was still, in ways both visible and traceable and in ways invisible and diffuse, living with what she had done. The soldiers and civilians recorded in the SIGAC logs she transmitted were not returned to life. Namir Noor-el-Din and Saeed Shmaf were not brought back by their footage being seen. The governments that had been embarrassed by the cable traffic had rebuilt their relationships with American diplomacy, or they had not. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had continued after the disclosures, and had ended imperfectly in their own time and on their own terms. But the record existed now. The record that had been sealed behind classification walls was part of the public archive, studied by historians, cited by journalists, referenced in legal proceedings, taught in universities, used by the people who make decisions about war and secrecy and accountability as evidence of what those decisions actually look like from the inside. That was what Chelsea Manning had decided the world needed to see. That was what she had risked everything to make available. Whether it was worth the cost she paid is a question she has answered, consistently in her own words, and the answer she has given has not changed. The world, she believed, deserved to know. She gave it the chance to know. What the world chose to do with that knowledge was, in the end, not hers to control, and she had understood that from the beginning.